The gun was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Ellie Boone crouched behind the dumpster in the storage lot behind Henderson Avenue and held the flashlight beam steady on the thing she had found, making sure her hands did not touch it, making sure her breath did not fog the plastic. The bag was clear. The weapon inside was black and compact and clean in a way that outdoor things are never clean. No rust, no weathering, no grime worked into the seams between the grip and the frame. Someone had put this here recently. Someone had put this here on purpose. She clicked the flashlight off and pressed her back against the cold metal of the dumpster and looked up at the sky above Millhaven, Oregon, where the clouds had moved in from the coast and erased every star. The brick wall of the Iron Ridge Riders clubhouse rose 30 feet in front of her, dark and windowless on this side, and from somewhere around the front of the building, she could hear the low idle of a motorcycle engine turning over in the cold. Her father's voice came to her the way it always did, not as a sound but as a certainty, the kind of knowledge that lives in the chest rather than the head. The most dangerous thing in a room is not the weapon, Ellie. It is the person nobody is watching. She had been nobody for 19 days. She was starting to think that might be the most useful thing she had ever been. 19 days earlier, she had climbed out of the bathroom window of the apartment on Ridgeline Avenue at 2 o'clock in the morning, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and sneakers whose left sole had started separating at the toe. She had not taken anything except a gas station lighter she had found on the sidewalk 3 weeks before that. No phone, no money, no plan. Just the knowledge that if she stayed in that apartment one more night, something would break that could not be fixed. Dale Roth had thrown the kitchen chair at her mother at 11:45. She heard the impact from her room, the specific hollow crack of furniture against flesh, the silence that followed, which was always worse than the sound. Her mother did not cry out anymore. That was the thing that had changed over the past 8 months. Grace Boone had stopped making noise when it happened, and that silence was somehow more frightening than screaming would have been, because it meant she had moved somewhere inside herself where the outside world could not reach her. Ellie had pressed herself against the wall beside her bedroom door and listened to Dale's footsteps crossing the kitchen, unhurried, the particular tread of a man who had already decided the evening was finished and was moving on to other things. She heard the refrigerator open, the crack of a beer can, the television coming on in the living room, volume up, comfortable. She waited 20 minutes. Then she went through the bathroom window. The drop to the fire escape was 8 feet. She landed wrong and her left ankle protested, and she sat on the grate for 30 seconds, breathing through her nose until the pain settled into something she could move on from. Then she went down the stairs and into the alley and walked north on Ridgeline Avenue without looking back. She counted days the way some people count breaths during panic attacks. Not because the number meant anything, because counting gave her brain something to do during the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning, when the cold stopped being uncomfortable and became something else entirely, something that crawled into the chest and made breathing shallow and whispered things she refused to listen to. Day 1, the parking structure on 4th Street. Cold concrete, engine oil, smelled the distant sound of traffic moving through a city that did not know she was in it. Day 4, the crawl space beneath the abandoned laundromat on Pine. Too low to sit upright, but dry mattered more than anything when the November rain started coming in sideways off the coast. Day 8, the storage lot behind the clubhouse on Henderson Avenue. She found it by accident, or by the particular kind of accident that happens when you have been walking the same neighborhoods for a week and certain places start asserting themselves as safer than others. The fence on 3 sides blocked the wind. The dumpster broke the sight line from the street, and the bikers, whoever they were, never came around to this side of the building after 10 o'clock at night. The Iron Ridge Riders. She had seen the patch on their leather cuts enough times to memorize it without trying. A mountain ridge with a single iron bolt driven through its peak. Below it, the letters IRR in block font. The town talked about them the way small towns talk about things they have decided to be afraid of, with a certainty that felt more like a habit than a conclusion, more like something inherited than something earned. At the shelter intake desk on Birch Street, where she had stopped on day 3 looking for a bed that turned out not to exist, the woman behind the counter had told her to stay away from that end of town. "Those men are trouble, honey. You stay away from Henderson Avenue." That woman had also handed her an expired granola bar and pointed her toward the door. On day 8, the biker named Hank Cross had given her a turkey sandwich, still in its plastic wrap, a bottle of water, a pair of wool socks in their original packaging, and a $20 bill tucked under the water bottle without making a production of it. He had not asked for anything in return, had not asked her name, had crouched down to her eye level in the parking lot of the gas station on 4th Street and set the bag on the curb beside her and said it was going to freeze tonight, and did she have somewhere to go? And when she said she was fine, he had looked at her for 3 full seconds with eyes that were doing actual math. Not the dismissive calculation of an adult deciding a problem was too complicated to engage with, but something more careful and more deliberate than that. The look of a man making a decision about what kind of person he intended to be in the next 30 seconds. He tucked the 20 under the water bottle and walked back to his truck and pulled out of the lot onto Henderson Avenue without looking back. She watched the truck turn into the Iron Ridge lot and disappear behind the fence. That night, she moved her sleeping spot from the Pine Street crawl space to the storage lot behind the clubhouse. Not because she trusted the Iron Ridge riders. She did not trust anyone. But because a man who buys wool socks still in their packaging for a stranger sleeping on a curb is probably not the kind of man who would hurt a kid sleeping behind his building. Probably. She had been there 4 nights when she found the gun. Now she sat in the dark with her back against the dumpster and her hands pressed flat against her thighs and thought about what she knew and what she did not know and what the distance between those two things meant. Someone had placed a police-issue pistol in a tactical canvas wrap behind the Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse. The bag was clean and dry, which meant it had been placed recently within the last day or two at most, because this part of Oregon in November did not keep anything dry for long. The canvas was military grade, not something you would find in a residential garage or a sporting goods store. Whoever had done this had not been careless. They had been deliberate, and they had known exactly what they were doing. And deliberate meant there was a reason. She did not know the reason yet, but she knew how to find out. She had spent a year and a half learning to read situations that were not meant to be read by her. She had learned it not in school but in the apartment on Ridgeline Avenue, where understanding what the adults around her were actually doing versus what they were saying they were doing was not an academic exercise. When your sense of physical safety depends on correctly interpreting the behavior of a man whose moods are not predictable, you develop a particular quality of attention. You learn to notice the gap between the surface and the thing underneath it. The gap here was very wide. The next morning, she was at the Millhaven Public Library when it opened at 9. She found a terminal in the back corner, the one farthest from the circulation desk, and sat down and began with what she had. The man she had seen coming and going from the lot across Henderson Avenue, the one who did not move like a biker, who moved like someone trained to measure distance and calculate angles before committing to any direction, had walked into a storefront 2 blocks south of the clubhouse. She had seen it twice. The storefront had a sign in the window that she had read from the bus bench across the street. She typed the name into the search bar, Warren Briggs. 47 results came back in the first page. She read from the mom and did not stop until she had read everything on the first 3 pages. Warren Briggs, 56 years old, candidate for Millhaven City Council 3rd District, former principal at Briggs Halloran Development Group, a regional real estate development firm with projects across Southern Oregon and Northern California. Endorsed by the Millhaven Chamber of Commerce and the Oregon Property Owners Alliance. Campaign platform centered on what his website called responsible urban revitalization, which was language she recognized as meaning something was going to be torn down and replaced with something that made more money for fewer people. She scrolled down until she found a PDF of a planning commission presentation from 6 months earlier. She opened it and read every page. It was dense with municipal language about tax increment, financing, and zoning variance requests and projected property value increases per square foot. And she read all of it because she had learned that the things people worked hardest to make boring were usually the things that mattered most. The development corridor in question was Henderson Avenue from 5th Street to 9th Street. She pulled up a map. The Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse sat at the corner of Henderson and 7th, right in the middle of the corridor. She sat back in the chair and looked at the map for a long time. The library was quiet around her. A woman in her 60s was reading at the table to her left. An older man was sleeping upright in a chair near the periodicals section, glasses still on his face, head tipped back at the angle of someone who came to the library for the warmth rather than the books. A teenager with headphones was doing homework at the terminal 2 spots down. Nobody looked at Ellie. Nobody ever looked at Ellie. She thought about this gun in its clean plastic bag. She thought about the man in the fitted jacket who moved with the controlled precision of someone who had been trained to do so and had practiced until it was automatic. She thought about what it would take to clear a city block that a motorcycle club had occupied for 30 years. You could not buy them out if they did not want to sell. You could not rezone them out of existence if they were not violating any ordinances. But if they got raided, if law enforcement found a stolen police weapon on their property, a department-issue weapon with its serial number deliberately left traceable, so it could be identified and verified and arrested their members, and the story ran on every local television station by the 6 o'clock news, with photographs of leather-clad men in handcuffs and a police spokesperson explaining the evidence that had been recovered on the premises. Then the property would be available. Then Warren Briggs could build his quarter. She thought about this the way she thought about most things, slowly and without panic, turning each piece over and examining its underside before setting it down and picking up the next one. The gun was the mechanism, Briggs was the motive. The man in the fitted jacket was the instrument, and the Iron Ridge Riders were the target. That evening, she did something that required more courage than finding the gun had. The Millhaven Community Center was a squat brick building 2 blocks from the library that smelled like floor wax and old coffee and the institutional mustiness of a space that hosted too many meetings about things that never quite changed. The town hall meeting was in the basement. She found a side door propped open with a folding chair and slipped through it and took a seat in the back row between an elderly woman with a wooden cane and an empty folding chair that nobody claimed for the duration of the event. The room was maybe half full, 60 people on folding chairs arranged in rows facing a podium at the front. A banner above the podium read, "Millhaven Forward, Building Our Future Together," in the blocky, optimistic font of civic ambition, trying to look inevitable. Behind the podium stood Warren Briggs. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair combed back from a tan forehead and teeth that caught the overhead light when he smiled, which he did often, and with the practiced ease of a man who has rehearsed warmth until it looks effortless. He wore a navy blazer over an open-collared shirt, and he spoke with the particular confidence of a man who has never been genuinely uncertain in a room, who has always understood that rooms like this one are performances and he is the lead. He did not say the name Iron Ridge Riders. He did not have to. He talked about organizations that operate outside the law and outside the values of the community. He talked about elements that suppress property values and make streets feel less safe for families. He talked about the community's right to reclaim its own neighborhoods from interests that have held them back for too long. And then he showed slides, architectural renderings of a mixed-use development with a rooftop garden and ground floor retail space and 48 units of market-rate housing, everything sleek and bright and contemporary, populated in the renderings by people who looked like they had been selected by a committee to represent an aspiration rather than an actual population. The building at the center of every rendering stood exactly where the Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse stood now. Ellie sat in her folding chair and felt something moving through her that was not fear and was not the low constant anxiety of survival. Something sharper, something that had a direction and was beginning to find it. After the meeting, she stood outside in the cold and watched Warren Briggs work the room through the glass doors of the community center entrance, shaking hands, accepting the specific deference of people who had already decided to trust him before he opened his mouth. The man in the fitted jacket was parked at the curb in a black SUV. He stepped out when Briggs emerged, opened the rear door, and Briggs climbed in without fully breaking his handshake with a man wearing a city commissioner's lanyard around his neck. The SUV pulled away from the curb and moved down the street and turned left and was gone. Ellie memorized the plates. The next afternoon, she followed the SUV on foot. This required the kind of patience that is not taught, but developed through extended exposure to circumstances in which moving too quickly costs you more than waiting. She picked it up on Henderson Avenue at 2:15 in the afternoon, parked on the south side of the street, with its nose angled to give its driver a direct sight line to the Iron Ridge Clubhouse gate. She crossed to the opposite sidewalk and walked at the pace of someone with a destination, hands in the front pocket of her hoodie, watching from the edge of her peripheral vision. At 2:47, the driver got out and walked the block slowly, not pausing at any specific point, not taking photographs, not doing anything that would register as surveillance to anyone who was not already looking for it. He had the controlled movement of a professional, the kind of deliberate looseness that is actually its opposite, total awareness, wearing the costume of casual attention. He went around the corner onto 7th Street, and she followed at half a block of distance on the far side of the road. He walked 3 blocks south and turned onto Ridgeline Avenue. She stopped at the corner. She knew this street. She knew it by the way the light fell between the buildings in the late afternoon amber, and lo, the way it fell in November, when the sun was already thinking about leaving before 5. She knew it by the sound the fire escape on the east building made when the wind came in off the river. She had lived on this street for 14 months. She had climbed off it through a bathroom window 8 nights ago. The man stopped halfway down the block. Not at her building, at the building next to it. He stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the windows on the 3rd floor for 90 seconds, not long enough to look like loitering, long enough to see whatever he had come to confirm. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come. Ellie stood at the corner and watched him until he was out of sight. Then she looked at the building he had been watching. Then she looked at the building next to it. The windows of apartment 4B were lit against the gray afternoon. Through the glass, she could see the blue-white glow of a laptop screen and a man seated at the kitchen table. Dale Roth. He was in the position he occupied when he was watching the game or eating the dinner her mother had made, but he was not watching anything passive. He was leaning forward with both forearms on the table, papers spread around the laptop. What looked like a map printed on regular paper with handwritten annotations in the margins. His head was bent toward a phone he was holding to his ear. He was talking in a voice she had never heard from him before. Not the flat, dismissive voice he used with her mother. Not the cold, controlled voice he used when he wanted to establish what would happen if certain lines were crossed. A third voice entirely, quieter and more precise. The voice of a man conducting business that he took seriously and that he was good at. She stood on the sidewalk below the window and watched for 45 seconds, and then kept walking. She did not understand exactly what she was seeing. Not yet. But she filed it in the part of her mind that organized things not by category, but by the feeling they produced, the particular unsettled pressure of 2 separate things pressing toward each other from opposite directions without quite finding the point of contact. That night, she lay behind the dumpster in the lot behind the clubhouse and turned everything over and over until the cold made her hands too stiff to hold the thoughts clearly. She covered herself with the blue tarp and closed her eyes and did not sleep until almost 4 in the morning. By the time the light changed, she had made a decision. The morning after she found the gun, Ellie woke before 5 and lay still with her eyes open and listened to the storage lot around her. The wind had come around to the north overnight and was pressing against the fence on the east side with a steady low sound, and somewhere above the roofline, a piece of loose flashing on the clubhouse building was tapping in an irregular pattern that was almost rhythmic, but not quite. She had learned to use sounds like that as anchors, small, persistent things that grounded her in the specific moment when the hours between 2 and 5 tried to make everything feel like it was happening in no particular time at all. She thought about her father. Marcus Boone had talked to her about the difference between things worth being afraid of and things that only felt frightening because they were unfamiliar. He had said this when she was 9 years old and refusing to swim past the lane markers at the city pool, and he had said it in the patient way he said things he meant to stay with her slowly and without ornament, looking at her directly so she would understand it was worth attending to. Fear of something real serves you, he had said. Fear of something unfamiliar only limits you. The difference is worth learning to feel. The gun under the canvas behind the dumpster was a fear worth having. Not because the gun itself was pointed at her, but because the intent behind its placement was pointed at something, and that something was the building she was sleeping against and the people inside it, including the man who had bought her wool socks without asking anything in return. She did not move the gun. She understood without being told that moving it would be a mistake, that the location of the evidence and the condition of the evidence were both part of the story it was going to be able to tell, and that touching it with her hands would add her fingerprints to the outside of the bag and complicate whatever came next. She covered it again with the canvas exactly as she had found it and moved her tarp to the far corner of the lot. Then she started watching. The surveillance patterns she documented over the next 11 days were more consistent than she had expected. The black SUV appeared on a schedule that had suggested planning rather than improvisation at intervals that told her whoever was driving it was accountable to someone who wanted regular updates rather than acting on their own initiative. Tuesday mornings at 8, Thursday afternoons between 2 and 3, Saturday evenings around 5. and then variations on that pattern in between. Shorter appearances, drive-bys, rather than stationary surveillance, as if whoever had designed the operation understood that fixed patterns were detectable and had built-in randomness to prevent exactly the kind of tracking she was doing. What they had not built in was protection against a 13-year-old girl with nowhere else to be and nothing competing for her attention. She watched from the bus bench across the street, from the corner of the block where a doorway recessed enough to stand in without drawing notice, from the library window that looked down at an angle onto the east end of Henderson Avenue. She watched and she noted and she thought about what the pattern meant and what it was building toward, and she carried the thinking with her through the hours when there was nothing to watch, turning it over in this part of her mind that had learned to work on problems continuously in the background, while the front of her mind managed the immediate tasks of staying warm and finding food and not being noticed by the wrong people. On day 12, 3 days after finding the gun, and 4 days before walking through the front door of the clubhouse, she had been sitting on the bus bench in the late afternoon when one of the Iron Ridge riders came out of the clubhouse gate and crossed the street toward the gas station on the corner. He was younger than most of the members she had observed, early 30s, with tattoo sleeves visible below his jacket cuffs, in a way of moving that suggested permanent low-level energy, as if standing fully still was not something his body had mastered. He bought something inside the gas station and came back out and was walking past the bench when he stopped. He looked at her the way most adults looked at her, with the quick assessment and the swift decision to not engage that she had come to expect from people who recognized a homeless teenager, and immediately calculated that engaging would cost them something they did not want to spend. Then he looked at the bench she was sitting on and at the angle from the bench to the clubhouse gate, and his expression shifted slightly. "You've been sitting there a lot," he said. It was not accusatory. It was a statement that invited a response without demanding one. "Bus stop," she said. He looked at the bus schedule posted on the pole beside the bench. He was quiet for a moment. "Buses stop running on this route at 7, he said. "Last one came by at 4:42. She did not say anything. He looked at her for another moment. Then he pulled a granola bar from the bag he was carrying and set it on the bench beside her and kept walking. This was rote, she would learn later. He had not mentioned the encounter to Hank or anyone else in the clubhouse. He had simply registered what he observed and responded to it in the way he apparently responded to most things, directly and without a committee meeting. She ate the granola bar. It was peanut butter chocolate chip, and it was the best thing she had eaten in 2 days. The library was where she went when she needed to think without being cold and without being visible enough that someone might ask her to leave. The public library on 2nd Street opened at 9 and stayed open until 7 on weekdays, and the librarians had developed a policy, or at least a practice, of not asking sleeping patrons to leave as long as they were not disturbing other people. She had slept in the periodicals chair twice, and both times woken to find that someone had placed a cup of water on the table beside her without waking her, and she had never determined who. She used the library terminals for research that she could not do on paper. She read everything she could find about Warren Briggs in the Mill Haven Forward Development Proposal and the Henderson Avenue Planning Corridor. She read the financial disclosure forms his campaign committee had filed with the state elections office, which were dense and carefully constructed to be as technically accurate and substantively uninformative as possible, but which contain, if you read them with the right kind of attention, the outline of what was actually happening. She also, on day 15, found a copy of the Millhaven property tax rolls for the Henderson Avenue corridor, available through a municipal transparency portal that she had discovered by following a link from a city council meeting agenda. The property tax rolls showed the assessed values of every parcel on the relevant blocks, the ownership history, and the dates of any recent transfers. 4 of the parcels had changed hands in the past 18 months. Each transfer was from the city to a buyer listed as an ALLC with a name that referenced no individual person and gave no clue to its actual ownership. Each transfer price was below the assessed value. Each had been approved by the Property Commission. She wrote down every LLC name on the back of the library bookmark, along with their transaction dates and amounts. Then she went to the Oregon Secretary of State Business Registry and looked up each LLC. 2 of them listed their registered agent as a law firm in Portland. 1 listed its registered agent as an individual whose name she could not connect to anything else she had found. And 1, the most recently formed, and the one with the largest transaction, listed its managing member as Ridgeline Security Solutions. She sat in front of the terminal and looked at that entry for a long time. Then she wrote it down and folded the bookmark and put it in the front pocket of her hoodie and logged off the terminal and walked back to Henderson Avenue. She gave herself 2 more days of watching before she moved. On the first of those days, the black SUV appeared twice. Once at 8 in the morning on Henderson, once at 2 in the afternoon on the cross street, positioned differently each time but serving the same purpose. She confirmed the plates matched what she had memorized from the town hall. She noted the times in the margin of a library bookmark she had been using as a notebook substitute. She looked at the emerging pattern and recognized it for what it was. On the second day, she went back to the library and spent 3 hours reading everything publicly available about the Henderson Avenue Development Plan, the Planning Commission meeting minutes, the campaign finance disclosures filed by Warren Briggs's campaign committee, the property transaction records for the relevant blocks. The documents were dense and deliberately tedious, written in the register that municipal government uses when it wants something to look routine, and she read all of them because the most important information is usually hidden inside the most boring language. At 2 in the afternoon, she found the connection she had been looking for without knowing the exact shape of what she was looking for. A shell company called Ridgeline Security Solutions appeared in a property transfer record from 11 months earlier. The company had received a consulting payment from an LLC called Millhaven Forward Partners. The payment was for $47,000. The stated purpose was security assessment and site evaluation services. She wrote the name on the back of the library bookmark. Ridgeline Security Solutions. She looked at the name and felt the 2 separate things in her mind press closer together. Ridgeline, the name of her street. She walked back to the storage lot in the gray afternoon and sat down against the dumpster with her tarp around her shoulders and stayed there until dark, turning every piece over and holding each one up and examining it from multiple angles the way her father had taught her to examine anything she did not yet understand, with patience and without rushing toward a conclusion that felt good before she had checked whether it was actually true. On the 19th day, Ellie Boone pulled on the cleanest clothes she had, which were not very clean, and walked around the side of the building and stood in front of the Iron Ridge Riders clubhouse and looked at the front door. It was a heavy wooden door, dark-stained with a small panel of frosted glass set into the upper portion. A hand-painted sign hung beside it, "Members Only." Below that, in letters smaller and less formal than the ones above, "Community Welcome. Wednesdays 6 to 8 p.m. It was a Tuesday. She pulled the door open and walked inside. The warmth arrived first, then the smell of coffee and old leather and the particular mineral character of a space that had absorbed decades of engine work and tobacco and the accumulated physical presence of men who spent their lives doing things with their hands. It was not unpleasant. It reminded her of something she had to reach for before she could identify it. Her father's workshop in the garage of the house on Callaway Street. Before the house was sold, after he died and the workshop was emptied, and everything that had been his became part of an estate that settled for less than it was worth because her mother did not have the energy to fight for more. The room was large and open. A long bar ran along one wall. A pool table occupied the back corner under a hanging light. 6 mismatched tables were scattered across a wooden floor scarred and darkened with decades of boot traffic. 4 men sat at a table near the bar. 2 others stood by the pool table with cues in their hands mid-game. Every one of them turned to look at her at the same moment, and the silence that settled over the room was total in the way that only unexpected things produce total silence. Ellie stood in the doorway. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 91 pounds. She was wearing a hoodie that had not been washed in 19 days, and sneakers with a sole that was separating at the left toe and dark circles carved deep under her eyes and dirt under her fingernails that no amount of gas station bathroom scrubbing had been able to fully remove. She was 13 years old and she had been sleeping outside for 19 nights, and she was the most frightened she had been since the bathroom window. But her voice, when it came out, did not shake. She was surprised by that. She had expected it to shake. "I need to talk to whoever is in charge." One of the men at this table leaned back in his chair. Thick-armed head shaved clean, a scar running from his left ear to the angle of his jaw. He started to say something. "Let her talk." The voice came from the end of the bar, unhurried, without volume but with weight. The man who had given her the socks stepped forward from where he had been standing with a coffee mug in his hand and looked at her with the same steady attention she remembered from the watch station parking lot. Up close, he was larger than she had registered then, with gray threaded through a dark beard and lines around his eyes that mapped a geography of decisions made under pressure over a long span of time. The patch on his leather cut read President. Below the patch, his name. Hank Cross. Sit down, he said, not a command. An offer with a chair pulled back from the nearest table to make it concrete. Ellie sat. Her legs were trembling, but the chair was solid beneath her, and the warmth of the room was already beginning to loosen something in her chest that had been wound tight for a long time. What is your name? Ellie. Ellie what? She hesitated for one beat. Boone? Something moved in Hank's face, small enough that she almost missed it. He set his coffee mug on the table and looked at her for a moment, and then looked at the man with the scar. Body, back lot, check it. Body was out of his chair and through the rear door before Hank finished the sentence. You said you need to talk, Hank said. So talk. She told him everything. She told it in order without editorializing, because she had learned that adults believe specific details more than they believe emotions. And what she had were specific details. Many of them gathered over 11 days of watching from bus benches and library terminals and sidewalk corners. She told him about the storage lot and the 4 nights she had been sleeping there. She told him about finding the gun, described the plastic bag, the tactical canvas wrap, the way the weapon lay flat against the concrete as if it had been measured and placed with care. She told him about the man in the fitted jacket and the black SUV and the pattern of surveillance she had tracked over 11 days. She told him about the town hall meeting and Warren Briggs and the architectural renderings with the clubhouse erased from the map and replaced by a glass-fronted building with a rooftop garden. And then she told him about the walk down Ridgeline Avenue, the man pausing to look at the third-floor windows, and Dale Roth at the kitchen table with the professional voice she had never heard from him before, and the papers spread around the laptop and the name of the company she had found at the library. Ridgeline Security Solutions. The room was completely quiet when she finished. She could hear the coffee machine ticking behind the bar. She could hear the wind pressing against the front windows. One of the men near the pool table had set his cue down at some point during her account and had not picked it back up. Hank Cross was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read. Not skepticism, not pity, something that contained both and had moved past both into territory that did not have a simple name. The rear door opened. Body came back in. He was carrying a clear plastic bag gripped by its exterior, his fingers pressing against the outside so that nothing on his skin touched the surface within. Inside the bag was a black pistol. He set it on the bar without speaking and looked at Hank. Planted, Body said. Canvas wrap, fresh placement, no weathering on the bag. Hank nodded once. Hank, Body's voice dropped lower. That is a department-issue Glock. Serial is intact. The room went very still. Ellie looked from Body to Hank and saw something pass between them that was not words and was not a signal, but was a shared understanding of what a police-issue weapon planted on their property, with its serial number deliberately left traceable, would mean if it were found by the wrong person at the right moment. It would mean evidence. It would mean a raid. It would mean every headline Warren Briggs would ever need to clear Henderson Avenue and break ground on his corridor. Hank picked up his phone and dialed. 2 rings. Rita? He said it like a name he had said before in exactly this register. The register of someone who needs something urgent and is not going to waste time explaining why. I need you at the clubhouse. Now, bring your badge and do not tell anyone where you are going. A pause. Because someone just tried to end us and a 13-year-old girl is the only reason it did not work. He hung up and looked at Ellie. How long have you been sleeping outside? It does not matter. It matters to me. She looked at the crack in the wood grain of the table. Old and dark, the kind of mark a surface accumulates over decades of use rather than any single event. She traced it with one finger. 19 days. She said quietly enough that it cost her something to say it. Hank did not flinch. He did not soften into the look she had been dreading, the one that meant pity, which in her experience was only ever another way of saying powerlessness. He stood up, walked around to the back of the bar, and came back with a plate. 2 pieces of toast with butter and a glass of orange juice. He set them in front of her and sat down. Eat, he said, and then we figure out the next thing. Ellie picked up the toast. Her hand was shaking. She took a bite, and for a moment the warmth of the bread and the taste of the butter were so overwhelming that her vision blurred at the edges. She blinked hard and kept chewing. You said your last name is Boone, Hank said. Yes, your father's name. It was not a question. She looked up. Hank Cross had stood from the table and was walking toward the far wall, toward a board she had not noticed before in the room, a long piece of dark-stained wood mounted at eye level with names painted on it in careful block letters. Some of the names were in white. Some were in a different color, a dark reddish-brown that took her a moment to understand was meant to mark a different category of belonging. He stopped in front of it. She could not see his face from where she sat. She could only see the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that falls over a body when it arrives at the specific place it has been moving toward without knowing it. "Marcus Boone," he said. The words were quiet enough that she had to work to hear them clearly. "My father," she said. Hank turned around. His face had changed, not collapsed into anything dramatic or obvious, but something had rearranged itself in the deep structure of his expression, some load-bearing element shifting, and the man who turned to face her across the room was carrying more weight than the man who had walked away from the table 30 seconds before. "Marcus was my brother," he said. The glass of orange juice was in her hand. She did not remember picking it up. It slipped. The orange juice spread across the table in a slow, unhurried tide, and Ellie sat completely still, staring at the man across the room at the wall with her father's name on it, in the dark red of someone who had belonged here and was gone at the gap between everything she had understood about her own life and the thing that was rearranging itself in front of her. The man who had bought her wool socks, still in their packaging. The man whose last name matched her father's name on a wall of fallen brothers. The man who had been without her knowing, without either of them knowing her blood. Outside, the sound of a motorcycle engine broke the silence. Then another. Then a third. Through the frosted glass of the front door, shadows were arriving on Henderson Avenue. And across Millhaven, in a campaign office on 5th Street with the overhead lights still on and the blinds open to the street, a phone was ringing in a way that suggested the evening had just become more complicated for the person who would have to answer it. The orange juice dripped off the edge of the table and hit the wooden floor in a rhythm that sounded like a clock that had been running for a long time and was only now audible to the people in the room. Ellie did not move. She was a Boone, and she had been invisible for 19 days, and she had just walked into the only room in Millhaven where someone had been waiting for her without knowing they were waiting. The clock had been running for a long time. It was only now that she could hear it. She thought about what it meant to be invisible. Not the metaphorical kind of invisible that people described when they felt overlooked or underappreciated, but the literal operational kind, the state of existing in a space in such a way that the people around you process your presence as part of the background rather than as a person requiring response. She had not chosen this. It had been imposed on her by circumstances and by the particular combination of her age and her situation, and the city's trained tendency to look past certain kinds of people in certain kinds of condition. But she had learned to use it, and using it had taught her things about how the world worked that she would not have learned any other way. When you are invisible, you see everything. You see the way people who are performing ease are actually tense at the shoulders. You see the way attention shifts in a room when someone significant enters, even before anyone has acknowledged the entrance. You see which way people look when they are about to lie, and which way when they are about to say something true that costs them. You see the 3-second pause before the thing that matters is said, and you learn to listen for the 3 seconds rather than for the words that follow. She had been doing this in the apartment on Ridgeline Avenue for 14 months, reading Dale Roth the way a navigator reads weather, using every visible sign to anticipate what was coming so that she could position herself and her mother at whatever angle gave them the best chance of getting through the next hour. She had been doing it in the storage lot behind the clubhouse and on the bus benches and in the library and at the town hall meeting. She had been doing it since the night her father died and her mother began to disappear, and she understood for the first time that the adults in her life were not going to be able to guarantee her safety in any consistent way. The gun behind the dumpster had been visible to her because she was the kind of person who had learned to look for things that did not belong in a space. Most adults would not have noticed the canvas under the tarp. Most people moving through a parking lot at night are thinking about where they are going rather than examining what the ground beneath them is telling them. But Ellie had been sleeping on the ground for 12 days and had learned the specific vocabulary of every surface she occupied, and something new on that surface registered the way a change in sound registers to someone who has learned to listen. She noticed it. She understood what she was looking at. And then she did not panic. This was perhaps the most important thing she had learned in 19 days, and perhaps the most important thing she had ever learned anywhere, which was that panic is the enemy of the information you need. Panic closes the aperture. It makes the world smaller and louder and full of only the thing that caused the panic, and it crowds out everything else. And everything else is usually where the answers are. She had pressed her back against the dumpster and breathed through her nose and let the information settle before she began to think about what it meant. And then she had thought about it carefully in order without rushing to a conclusion until she had something that felt like a real understanding rather than a frightened guess. This was what her father had taught her. She had not known he was teaching her. She had thought he was just being patient, just being the person he was just taking time with her in the way he took time with things he thought were worth time. But he had been teaching her something specific and she had learned it without knowing she was learning, which is how the most useful things are usually learned. Detective Rita Flynn arrived at the Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse at 9:47 in the evening, 40 minutes after Hank's call, and she came through the front door the way she did most things, without announcing herself, without waiting for anyone to make space, moving through the room with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 20 years walking into places where she was not expected and staying until she had what she came for. She was mid-40s, dark hair pulled back tight against her neck, wearing jeans and a gray jacket that did not quite conceal the badge clipped to her belt. Her eyes found Ellie immediately, and Ellie felt herself being assessed with the clean, clinical attention of someone trained to read damage quickly and accurately, and to do so without making the person being assessed feel like a case file. Rita crossed to the bar without preliminary conversation, examined the plastic-wrapped Glock without touching it, bent close and studied it from 3 angles, and was quiet for a long moment. When she turned back, the professional composure at the edges of her expression had thinned in a way that told Ellie she had seen something significant. Glock 19, she said. Standard department issue. If I run that serial, and I am going to run that serial, that is going to trace back to either an active officer's personal inventory or a weapon reported stolen from evidence lockup. She pulled a chair to the table and sat across from Ellie. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Do not skip anything, even the pieces that seem small or incidental. So Ellie told it again. The storage lot and the 4 nights sleeping there before she found the gun, the canvas wrap and the clean plastic bag, and the way the weapon lay flat against the concrete as if it had been measured before being placed. 11 days of watching the black SUV. The man in the fitted jacket and the way he moved in the specific pattern of surveillance she had tracked. The town hall meeting in the basement of the community center, and Warren Briggs and the architectural renderings with the clubhouse replaced by glass and steel. The walk down Ridgeline Avenue and the man pausing at the building next door. Dale Roth at the kitchen table with his professional voice and his papers and the laptop and the map with the handwritten annotations. The library, Ridgeline Security Solutions. When she finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet after something significant has been laid on the table, and everyone present is deciding what it means and what comes next. Sandra Locke had arrived an hour before Rita called by Hank, from a number he apparently kept stored under a name that gave away nothing. She was sitting in the corner booth with her laptop open in front of her, and she had been working without speaking since she arrived, occasionally requesting access to a second screen that Roach had propped against the wall for her. She was somewhere in her late 30s, with close-cropped auburn hair and wire-rimmed glasses, in the focused intensity of a person who finds structured data more reliable than most people find other human beings. No club affiliation, no leather cut, but the way the men in the room oriented around her with the careful attention you give to someone whose expertise you genuinely need told Ellie everything about her function in this situation. Sandra looked up from her screen. I have the first layer of the corporate chain, she said. Give me 2 more minutes on the second. Nobody spoke. Body stood against the bar with his arms folded, the scar on his jaw catching the overhead light at an angle that made it look recent, even though it was clearly not. Roach, wiry and young, with tattoo sleeves visible below his rolled cuffs, and a nervous energy that expressed itself in the constant motion of one leg, sat on a bar stool near the door watching Sandra's screen. Vance, the vice president, stood against the far wall with an unlit cigarette turning slowly between his fingers, a man who carried his skepticism like a physical object, something he had picked up long ago and never found a good reason to set down. Sandra's fingers went still. Briggs Development Group has 7 subsidiary LLCs, she said, all incorporated within the last 20 months. Shell companies layered in the standard obfuscation structure used by buyers who need to acquire property without anyone knowing who is actually doing the acquiring. She turned the laptop so Hank could see the screen. Columns of numbers, company names with no obvious connection to each other, formation dates in sequence, 4 blocks of Henderson Avenue, 2 blocks of Pine Street, the empty lot on Birch where the old lumber yard used to be, and she paused with the precision of someone who understands the value of timing even in the delivery of information. The building that currently houses the Millhaven Community Center. The same building where Briggs held his town hall meeting last week. One of his shell companies is already in negotiations to purchase it from the city. Who is selling for the city? Hank asked. The Property Commission. Sandra looked at him over her glasses. The commission chair is a man named Earl Vaughn. The temperature in the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Hank's expression did not move, but something behind it shifted, the specific internal adjustment of a man who has just heard a name in a context he was not prepared for. Vaughn, he said. You know him, Rita asked. He was my platoon sergeant, Fallujah, 14 months together. Nobody said anything for a moment. The coffee machine behind the bar ticked in the quiet. Outside on Henderson Avenue, a car passed and its headlights swept briefly across the frosted glass of the front windows. Then Ellie said, there is something else. Every head in the room turned toward her. She had been waiting, not performing patience, but actually waiting the way you wait when you have a piece that you know belongs somewhere in the structure, but you need to understand the current shape of the structure before you know where to place it. She looked at Sandra's screen at the layered corporate chain with its shell companies and formation dates, and she felt the two things that had been pressing toward each other in her mind for 3 days finally make contact. Ridgeline Security Solutions, she said. Sandra's fingers went still on the keyboard. That name is in the property records I found at the library, Ellie said. It received a payment from a Briggs LLC, $47,000. The listed purpose was security assessment services. I wrote it down. She pulled the library bookmark from her hoodie pocket and set it on the table. The name was written in pencil on the back, small and careful. Sandra was already typing. 20 seconds, 30. Ridgeline Security Solutions, Sandra said. Incorporated 14 months ago in Oregon. Managing member listed as. She stopped. Looked at the screen. Looked up. Carl M. Roth goes by Dale. The sound was not loud. Ellie did not scream. She did not make any of the sounds that the moment seemed to call for. What came out of her throat was something that arrived before words, a brief involuntary sound that she swallowed almost before it had fully formed. She pressed her hands flat against the edge of the table and felt the wood grain press back into her palms. He is my stepfather, she said. He lives with my mother on Ridgeline Avenue. The room reorganized itself around this information, the way rooms reorganize around the detonation of something that had been hidden inside an ordinary object. Not with drama or noise, but with the silent structural shift of people simultaneously revising everything they had been building toward in a direction they had not anticipated. Dale Roth was not only the man who hit her mother in the kitchen at 11:45 on a Tuesday night. He was not only a man with a company whose name matched the street Ellie had grown up on. He was the operational center of the conspiracy, the man placing the guns behind the clubhouse, the man directing the surveillance vehicles, the man whose professional voice she had heard through a window on Ridgeline Avenue without understanding what she was hearing. And Ellie had been sleeping behind the building he was paid to destroy. She had followed his surveillance vehicles through the streets of her own city. She had stood on the sidewalk below the window of the apartment where he lived with her mother and watched him work and had not known what she was looking at because the two parts of her life had been separated by a wall she had not known to look for. Did he know you were here? Hank asked. His voice was measured and careful, the voice of a man who understands that the next 30 seconds require precision above everything else. He never filed a missing person report, Ellie said. I checked at the library 3 days after I left. I searched my own name. There was nothing. No report. No news item. Nothing. She kept her hands on the table. He wanted me gone. I was in the apartment. I might have seen things. I might have heard things he did not want me to hear. She looked at Hank directly. He was running operations out of that apartment. The late-night phone calls, the meetings he said were work dinners, the papers he kept on the kitchen table that he moved to the bedroom whenever I came into the room. It was all this. It was all Briggs, and I was in the way. Hank moved around the table and crouched down in front of her, putting himself at her eye level, the way he had in the gas station parking lot, lowering himself without hesitation, because he understood that presence at eye level means something different than presence above. He did not touch her. He simply put himself where she could see him without having to look up. "You are here," he said. "You are safe. And now we know more than we did an hour ago." "My mother's in that apartment," Ellie said. Hank and Bodie exchanged a look over her head. "The moment this goes into a formal system, your mother's address gets flagged," Rita said quietly. "Roth will know. The system leaks. It always leaks, and it leaks at the worst possible moments." "Then we move before it goes formal," Ellie said. Nobody argued with her. This surprised her slightly. Hank stood. "Rita, how fast can you run the serial off the books?" "Tonight. But I have to be careful about the sequence. If anyone in the department is monitoring unusual queries on gang task force inventory records, I cannot tip them off before we have the full picture." "How long?" 2 hours. Maybe 3 if I have to route around internal monitoring." "Do it." He looked at Sandra. "Keep building the chain. I want the complete paper trail between Briggs and Roth documented before morning." He picked up his phone and scrolled to a number. He looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has been avoiding and has now run out of time to avoid. 1 ring. 2. A man's voice answered, rough in a way that suggested interrupted sleep or something harder to define. Hank said a name. He said he knew what time it was. He said Earl Vaughn had exactly 1 opportunity to position himself on the correct side of what was coming. He said the foundry on River Road 7 in the morning, come alone, because he knew about the shell companies and the property sales and the guns, and if Vaughn did not show, the next call would go to the FBI field office in Carver City, and Vaughn could explain to a federal prosecutor how a city property commission chair came to sell 4 blocks of Henderson Avenue to a man who was planting stolen police weapons on private property. He hung up. "You think he will come?" Bodie asked. "I think he will come because the alternative is worse," Hank said. Earl Vaughn has spent 30 years making choices he could explain to himself afterward. This one cannot be explained, and he knows it. It was Vance who moved away from the wall, first crossing to the table that had been covered with a sheet of plywood and spread with maps and printed documents, leaning both hands on its surface. "We need to talk about exposure," Vance said. His voice was what it always was, measured and precise, carrying the weight of someone who had seen things go sideways before and understood in detail why. "The girl's testimony is the foundation of all of this," Vance said. "A minor, homeless, no fixed address, with a direct family connection to the operational center of the conspiracy we are trying to expose. Any prosecutor worth the bar exam will call that manufactured. Briggs's team will flip the narrative the moment they see her in the picture. Uncle Hyde's runaway niece coaches her testimony, orchestrates a false flag to protect property he has a personal interest in." He looked at Ellie, not with hostility, with the flat appraisal of someone doing a risk calculation. "I am not saying she is wrong. I am saying the timing looks convenient." "She found the gun, Vance," Hank said. "She says she found the gun. The canvas wrap was fresh," Bodie said from the bar. "No weathering on the bag. That is physical evidence, not testimony. Physical evidence we did not preserve through proper chain of custody because we had a 13-year-old girl bring it to us before any law enforcement was involved." Vance straightened. "And if Briggs's people find out she is family, if they find out there is a personal stake in protecting her account, they have everything they need to turn this into a story about us instead of a story about them." The room divided the way rooms divide, not into factions or sides, but into the uncomfortable space of 2 things being simultaneously true. Ellie sat at the table and recognized the pattern. She had been the reason things fell apart before. She had been the presence that made situations more complicated and the target that gave other people's anger somewhere to go. She was about to say she would leave when Bodie moved. He came off the bar in 4 strides and stood in front of her, arms still folded, the scar on his jaw, putting a permanent line through the lower half of his face. "Nobody is going anywhere," he said. He looked at Vance, then at Hank. His voice was measured in the way that walls are measured, not to persuade, but to hold. "Vance is right about the optics," he said. "Hank is right about the girl. Both things can be true in the same room, And if this club cannot hold two truths at once, we have bigger problems than Warren Briggs. He looked at Vance. You want to protect the club. That is your job, and it is the right job. But protection does not mean pushing out the one person who saw what was coming before any of us did. He looked at Hank. And you need to tell her about Barstow. All of it. She deserves to know what she is standing next to before she decides whether to stand next to it. The room held its breath. Hank looked at Bodie for a long time. Then he nodded once and sat down at the table where the orange juice stain had dried to a faint watermark at the edge of the wood. 7 years ago, Hank said, and his voice had shifted into a lower register, rougher like something being pulled across gravel. A member of this club named Pete Landon got into serious trouble with a contractor working out of Barstow, California. The contractor was running unlicensed demolition jobs using workers who had no documentation and no legal protection. One of those workers was killed when a wall collapsed during a job. Pete found out about it. He wanted to go public. The contractor sent people to dissuade him. He stopped, picked up his coffee mug, set it back down without drinking from it. We went to Barstow, 8 of us. The plan was to confront the contractor, obtain documentation of the wall collapse and the worker's death, and hand everything to a journalist who had agreed to run the story. That was the plan. He looked at the mug. What happened was different. The contractor had hired security, armed. Pete lost his temper when they blocked the entrance. Things escalated beyond anything that had been planned. By the end of the night, 2 of the security men were in the hospital with serious injuries. Pete was in handcuffs, and the contractor's office was on fire. The worker who died was real, Bodie said quietly from across the room. His name was Emilio. He was 23 years old. Nobody ever heard about Emilio, Hank said, because the only story that came out of Barstow was bikers starting fights and burning buildings. We were right about the contractor and wrong about everything else. We handed them the headline, and they ran it for 3 weeks. He looked at Ellie. Your father called me the morning after it happened. He had seen it on the news. He said you want to be a hero, but you do not know how to be one without breaking something. He said he could not have his daughter anywhere near that kind of thing, and he was right. So he cut me off and changed his number, and I let him because I did not have a single argument that could beat what he had just told me. The electric heater upstairs hummed through the old floorboards. Outside on Henderson Avenue, an engine turned over somewhere in the front lot, its low, steady vibration moving through the building's brick and into the room. 2 years after Barstow, Marcus walked into a convenience store on a Tuesday night and died protecting a woman he had never met, Hank said. A man with a knife, Marcus stepped between them. He did not walk back out. Hank's voice stayed level, but Ellie could hear the thing underneath the levelness, the thing that the levelness was built on top of and was now pressing up through it. I did not find out for 3 days. My brother was dead for 3 days before anyone thought to tell me because he had made sure nobody in his life still had my number. Ellie clenched her jaw against what was trying to happen in her chest. Not here. She had 11 years of practice holding this particular grief closed, and she was not going to open it now in this room in front of these men. She pressed her teeth together until the moment passed. That is Barstow, Hank said. That is what Vance is worried about. And he should be worried because every mistake I made 7 years ago is still sitting in this room, like furniture nobody knows how to move. He looked at Vance. What do you need? Vance was quiet for a moment. The unlit cigarette was still between his fingers. He looked at Ellie and his expression had recalibrated, not softened exactly, but adjusted into something less armored, the look of a man who has demanded the truth and is now honestly reckoning with its weight. Every move goes through a vote, Vance said. Every significant decision gets checked by the table. If I think your judgment is compromised, I pull the brake. He held Hank's gaze. Agreed. Agreed. Ellie released a breath she had not known she was holding. At 11:42, Rita Flynn called from her car where she had been sitting with her laptop in a secure connection she had not explained in detail and which Ellie had decided not to ask about. Hank put the phone on speaker on the table. Rita's voice came through, clipped and precise, carrying the specific efficiency of a detective who has found something significant and is weighing each word before releasing it. The serial came back, she said. The gun is not from evidence lockup. It is from an active officer's personal inventory. An officer currently assigned to the gang task force. Nobody moved. The task force, Rita continued, received a donation of $50,000 in the last quarter from a PAC called Oregon Community Safety Partners. The PAC has one donor, Briggs Development Group. Body set down the glass he had been cleaning. The small sound it made was very specific in the silence. There is more, Rita said. I pulled traffic cam footage from Henderson Avenue. The SUV has been circling the block consistently for 3 weeks. Same plates every time. The vehicle is registered to a private security firm called Ashcroft Partners. She paused for 2 seconds, the pause of someone who has been building towards something. Ashcroft Partners lists its largest client as Briggs Development Group. And Ashcroft's corporate filing lists its managing entity as Ridgeline Security Solutions. The room absorbed this in layers, each sentence adding weight to the structure. Each connection revealed, making the full shape of the conspiracy more complete and more suffocating. They are not just coming for the clubhouse, Hank said. There is a second stolen weapon report, Rita said. Filed yesterday. Same officer, different gun. I do not know where the second weapon is, which means there is another planted gun somewhere in play, and this time we do not have any warning about when or where it will be used. The silence that followed had an edge in it that had not been present in any of the silences before, the specific edge of a clock that everyone in the room could now hear, and that was not going to stop. Ellie was the one who spoke first. He will put it at the apartment, she said. Every head turned. If the clubhouse is no longer safe as a placement point, if the first gun has been found and is in Rita's hands, he needs the second weapon somewhere that can still generate a raid, somewhere that connects this club to criminal activity through a different route. She kept her voice level and her hands still. He knows I left the apartment. He knows I am somewhere in this city. And if word gets back to him through any channel that a 13-year-old girl connected to his stepfather's operation has been sleeping behind the Iron Ridge clubhouse, the story he can build around a planted weapon at the apartment on Ridgeline Avenue writes itself. She looked at Hank. My mother is in that apartment, and she will not understand what is happening. She will be alone, and she will not know to call anyone. The room was very quiet. Rita, Hank said toward the phone, the apartment. I heard her, Rita said. I am already thinking about it. Give me 40 minutes and let me see what I can set up without triggering anything internal. She hung up. Hank was halfway to the door to get his jacket when Sandra spoke from the corner. Hank, he stopped. There is one more thing, Sandra said. The Ashcroft Partners corporate filing lists a business address for Ridgeline Security Solutions. She looked at her screen. Then at Ellie. 4B Ridgeline Avenue, Millhaven, Oregon. The apartment. Dale Roth had been running the operational arm of Warren Briggs's conspiracy from the kitchen table of the apartment where Ellie's mother was sleeping. Ellie looked at the table, at the crack in the wood grain that she had traced with her finger, what felt like a different version of this evening. She looked at the orange juice stain drying at the edge. She looked at Hank's face and saw something she had not seen in it since she walked through the door, which was the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a managed situation and has just watched it become something larger than management. We are going to fix this, he said. Not a clean promise, not the easy reassurance of someone who has not thought through what fixing it will cost. The promise of a man who has made promises before under similar pressure and understands exactly what it means to make one. Ellie nodded. At 12:58 in the morning, 3 things happened within 4 minutes of each other. First, Hank's phone received a text from Bodie, who had gone to check the front lot. The text read, silver sedan on Henderson. Plates traced to Ridgeline Security Solutions. Dale Roth was parked across the street from the clubhouse himself, not the black SUV that had been circling for 3 weeks and was now on everyone's radar. A different vehicle, a silver sedan that nobody had been watching for because nobody had known to watch for it, which meant Dale had been aware all along that the SUV was visible and had used it as misdirection while positioning himself differently. Second, the rear door of the clubhouse came off its hinges, not with force, with precision. The way a door comes off when the person removing it has the right tools and has done this before and wants the job done in under 5 seconds. There were 3 of them, dark tactical clothing, fitted jackets, moving through the back room with the economical urgency of professionals who have a timeline and intend to meet it. They went straight for the command table without hesitating, without searching, without doing anything that suggested uncertainty about where they were going or what they were there to take. What happened in the next 50 seconds left Bodie with a cut opening above his left eyebrow and blood running into his eye and Roach on the floor with his right arm bent at an angle that was not the arm's natural range of motion and two of the younger members bruised and breathing hard near the bar. The men in tactical gear took Sandra's laptop. They took every printed document on the plywood table. They did not take the phones. They did not take the flash drive that was not on the table because Sandra had not left it on the table. They were gone in less than 60 seconds. In the specific silence that followed, Ellie became aware of something she had missed in the chaos of the preceding minute. Vance was in the corner by the stairs with his hands behind his back. He was zip-tied, but the zip ties were on the exterior of his jacket sleeves, not through them. His hands were behind his back, not because anyone had forced them there, but because he had placed them there himself, and then someone had bound them. And the reason for this arrangement sat in the room like an object that everyone could see, and no one was yet willing to name. Third, the room went very quiet. Hank looked at Vance. Body came off the floor with the bar rag pressed to his eyebrow and blood on the front of his shirt, and looked at Vance. The back door key, Body said. His voice was even. The evenness cost him something. There are 4 copies. Hank has one, I have one. One lives in the safe behind the bar. He stopped. Let the 4th copy remain unspoken for a moment. They came through the back door with a key. They knew exactly which table. They knew exactly what was on it. They did not search. They did not hesitate. Hank looked at Vance for a long time. Vance, he said. Just the name. Quite enough that it required the room to be completely still to hear. Vance raised his head. The sardonic armor he usually wore was gone, and what was underneath it was older and more exhausted than anything Ellie had seen on another person's face. The look of a man who has been carrying the wrong thing for a long time and has finally set it down in the worst possible place. My daughter, Vance said. The words fell into the room the way heavy things fall into still water. Her name is Cassidy. She is 22 years old. She got into serious financial trouble 18 months ago. The kind of debt that does not have a legitimate way out. Bad choices and worse luck in the specific combination of those two things that buries people. He kept his eyes on Hank, not asking for anything with them, not performing remorse. Briggs's people found her. They paid off $47,000 in debt, and then they came to me and told me they owned her future. Give them what they needed, or they would destroy what she had built since then. Nobody spoke. 4 months, Vance said. I gave them schedules, meeting times. I told them about Sandra's analysis work, and last night I gave them the key. He paused. I tried to protect the most critical pieces. I withheld things that I thought would matter most. But I gave them enough, and now they have the laptop. The room held its collective breath in the way rooms hold breath when something irreversible has been said aloud, and everyone present is waiting to see what the shape of the aftermath will be. Then Sandra Locke held up a flash drive, small, silver, the size of her thumb. Everything, she said, every document, every spreadsheet, every corporate filing and transaction record, encrypted and backed up to this before I opened the laptop in this building. She adjusted her glasses with one finger. What kind of forensic accountant did you think you were dealing with? The exhale that moved through the room was almost audible. Roach, still on the floor against the pool table wall, made a sound that was equal parts laugh and something less composable than that. There is more, Sandra said. She came down from the corner, holding her phone, a separate device she had carried in her jacket pocket and which had been sitting there unremarked for the past hour. When they came through the back door, I started recording. 4 minutes and 37 seconds of audio. She looked at Hank. You can hear them communicating with someone giving instructions from off-site. The person giving instructions is on speaker on one of their phones. The voice is clear. She pressed play. The room listened. The audio was not distorted, not degraded by distance or ambient noise. It was the voice of a man who was accustomed to giving instructions and who was doing so with the unhurried precision of someone who had planned this sequence in advance and was watching it execute according to plan. Warren Briggs. His voice told them which table, which laptop, which documents to take, and which to leave. It told them to leave the girl alone if she was present because they needed clean optics for the next phase. It told them the timeline had been compromised by the disappearance of the first weapon and needed to be accelerated. It told them they had 48 hours to position the second weapon and execute the coordinated tip to the task force. 48 hours. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was different from every silence before it. Not the silence of uncertainty or of grief, or of people who have not yet decided what to do. The silence of people who have just heard the thing they needed to hear and are beginning to understand exactly what it changes. Ellie looked at Hank. 48 hours, she said. I know. The apartment on Ridgeline. He is going to move the second gun tonight or tomorrow morning, before any formal system knows to look for it, before Rita can set up anything through official channels. Rita is working on it, Hank said. But if Dale knows the first gun was found, if someone in Briggs' operation has figured out that the laptop did not have what they thought it had on it, he will accelerate. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands on the table. If SWAT goes through my mother's door at 2 in the morning on an anonymous tip and finds a stolen police weapon under the bathroom sink, she will not know what is happening. She will be alone. She will be frightened, and she will not know who to call. She held Hank's gaze across the table. I am the only person in this room who can walk up to that apartment without causing a situation. As far as Dale knows, I am just a runaway kid who disappeared into the city. If I show up, it is just me showing up. No, Hank said. The word carried the weight of a door closing. Then Rita needs to get there before he does, tonight, before the 48 hours starts. Hank looked at her. He looked at the 13-year-old girl who had been sleeping on concrete for 19 days and had walked through his door and laid out the anatomy of a conspiracy that would have destroyed everything he had built, with specific details in a library bookmark covered in penciled notes, and had not once asked for anything except to be taken seriously. He picked up his phone and dialed Rita. The phone rang 4 times, 6, 8. He lowered it, dialed again. Silence. He typed a text, set the phone on the table and watched it. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, no response. He dialed a 3rd time and listened to it ring until it stopped. Body set down the rag he had been holding against his eyebrow. The bleeding had slowed to a seep. His expression was very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. She always answers, he said. I know, Hank said. She was running an unauthorized investigation into a planted police weapon with a connection to a gang task force officer. She pulled restricted footage. She ran serial numbers through channels she was not supposed to access. If anyone inside the department noticed the queries. Do not say it, Hank said. But the shape of it was already present in the room. It did not need to be said to be understood. Rita Flynn had been building a case off the books alone, using access she was not supposed to have connected to a conspiracy that reached inside the Millhaven Police Department. She was not answering her phone. It was 1:47 in the morning. Ellie looked at the table, at the crack in the wood that she had traced with her finger in what now seemed like a different version of this evening, before the break-in, before Vance, before the recording. She looked at Hank's face and saw something she had not seen in it before that moment. Not fear for himself, not fear for the club or the property, or any of the abstractions that had been at stake for the past hours. Something underneath all of that. The specific fear of a man who is responsible for other people and is watching the edges of his control over their safety dissolve one piece at a time. What do we do? She asked. He looked at the phone in his hand, at the flash drive on the table, at Sandra's phone with its 4 minutes and 37 seconds that could not be undone. He looked at his niece. And for the first time since she had walked through his door 19 days into her homelessness and changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about the threat against his club, he looked like a man who did not have a clean answer to the question being asked, which was, she thought, the most honest thing he had done since she met him. And honesty, even the uncertain kind, was something she could work with. The room above the clubhouse where Ellie had been given the cot smelled like dust and old cardboard and the specific mineral sharpness of motor parts that had been stored there for a long time before Body and Roach carried the boxes out. The cot was narrow and the sleeping bag on it was rated for temperatures lower than any she had experienced even on the coldest nights in the storage lot. And she lay on it after the break-in and after Vance's confession and after Sandra held up the flash drive and the recording, and she looked at the ceiling and listened to the buildings settle around her. Old buildings settle with a particular vocabulary of sounds, creaks and pops, and the occasional groan of structural wood adjusting to changes in temperature and humidity, and she had learned this building's vocabulary over the past several nights. The sound from the northeast corner, near the roof that happened at around 3 in the morning when the temperature dropped to its lowest point. The sound from somewhere below the floorboards near the stairs, that happened when the building heated in the morning and the wood expanded. The sound the window made when the wind came from the west. She listened to these sounds and did not sleep. Through the floor, she could hear the low register of voices, Hank and Bodie and Sandra, working through what they had and what it meant and what came next. She could not make out words, but she could hear the rhythm of the conversation, the way the pace changed when something significant was said, the specific quality of quiet that followed each new piece of information being absorbed. She had spent 14 months in an apartment above people who made sounds through the floor, and she had learned to read the quality of silence, the way other people read, tone of voice, to understand what a particular kind of quiet meant about what was happening in the room below. The quiet she heard now from the clubhouse room below was not the quiet of a situation under control. It was the quiet of people working at the edges of what they knew how to do and not stopping. She respected that. She had also spent the 19 days since leaving the apartment on Ridgeline Avenue developing a specific relationship with uncertainty, the understanding that the feeling of not knowing what comes next is not the same as things being lost. It is simply the interval between what you know and what you will know, and what you do in that interval determines what the interval means. What she did in the interval was think. She thought about the second gun, about Dale Roth's operational logic, which she had been observing in fragments for months without knowing what she was observing. He was methodical. She knew this from the way the apartment on Ridgeline had been organized. The papers kept in specific order, the phone chargers in specific positions, the work materials always moved to the bedroom. When she came into the kitchen, moved back when she left, every time without variation. A methodical person does not abandon a plan when its primary mechanism fails. A methodical person has an alternative. The alternative in this case was the apartment. If the gun behind the clubhouse was gone, the gun needed to be somewhere that could still generate the outcome Briggs had paid for. The apartment on Ridgeline Avenue had Dale's name on the lease. It had presumably Dale's fingerprints on every surface. It had Grace Boone in it, who was in no condition to understand what was happening if law enforcement came through the door at 2 in the morning on an anonymous tip. And it had had until 19 days ago, the stepdaughter of the man running the operation. Ellie was not named on the lease. Her presence in the apartment for 14 months had not been legally documented in any way that would surface in a standard records check. If a search warrant was executed and a stolen police weapon was found under the bathroom sink, the resident of record was Dale Roth, and the woman present in the apartment was Grace Boone. And the story those two names would tell with the stolen police weapon between them would be the exact story Warren Briggs needed to complete his operation. She understood this with a clarity that was not comforting, but was at least useful. And she understood something else, which was that she was the only person in the building who had lived in that apartment and knew its layout, and knew where Dale kept his operational materials, and knew the specific way the building's front entrance worked, and knew that the second bedroom window, the one facing the fire escape, had a latch that had not engaged correctly since September, when Grace had tried to repaint the window frame and had gotten paint into the mechanism and had not had the energy afterward to get it fixed. She was not going to suggest going back there herself. She had told Hank the truth when she said she was the only person who could approach the apartment without creating a situation, and it was true, but the truth of it did not make it the right choice. Marsh was on his way. Rita, wherever she was working toward the same answer from a different direction. The right choice was to make sure the people who had the authority to act had everything they needed to act correctly and quickly, which was what she had the recording for. She looked at the window. The storage lot was visible in the gray pre-dawn light, the dumpster casting a long shadow toward the fence, the concrete empty and cold, the exact piece of ground where she had slept for 4 nights without knowing she was sleeping behind her father's history. She thought about Marcus Boone reading paperback westerns in the chair by the window and making pancakes on Saturday mornings and having a laugh that arrived and stayed longer than expected. She thought about the 9 years he worked at the shipyard and the Tuesday night he did not come home from it. She thought about the 2 years she had spent being furious at him for the choice he made in those 3 seconds outside the convenience store door. She was done being furious. Being furious at a dead person for being who they were was a tax on your own energy that paid nothing back. It did not change what happened. It did not recover what was lost. It was a door that stayed locked from the outside and had no keyhole on the inside. She turned away from the window. She lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and waited for the building to tell her through its sounds and vibrations when the moment downstairs had shifted into something that needed her, and she let the interval between what she knew and what she would know be what it was, which was not comfortable and not resolved but honest. That was enough. That was, she had come to understand over the past 19 days, often the most you could ask for. Hank set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment, then looked at the folded piece of paper he pulled from the inside pocket of his leather coat. He smoothed it flat on the table with 2 fingers. On it was a name and a phone number written in his careful block lettering, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write slowly and deliberately because he had learned that things written quickly were often misread later. Agent Cole Marsh, FBI Field Office, Carver City. He said it in front of Ellie. If Rita does not call by noon, he said, you call this number. Tell him everything. Do not leave anything out. Not Dale, not the shell companies, not Vaughn, not Barstow, everything. You are going to meet Vaughn alone, Ellie said. Yes, that could be a trap. It could be. She looked at the piece of paper, then at him. Why are you giving this to me instead of Bobby? Hank was quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when they have already decided what they want to say and are making sure the words are right before saying them. Because you are the one who saw it, he said. You followed the SUV. You went to the library. You sat in the back of that town hall meeting and read the architectural renderings and understood what they meant. You are the witness, not me, not Bodie, you. He held her gaze across the table. Your story, your voice. I can back it up. I cannot tell it. She looked at the piece of paper for a long moment, and then she folded it once and put it in the front pocket of her hoodie, the accessible pocket, not the deep one. Go, she said. He went. The sound of the Harley leaving Henderson Avenue at 6:43 in the morning was a clean, decisive sound, the kind of sound that moves through still air with direction and purpose. Ellie heard it through the walls and through the floor and felt it through the soles of her sneakers, and then it was gone into the city's early traffic, and there was only the room around her and the people in it and the piece of paper in her front pocket and the clock that everyone could hear now. She sat at the table with Sandra's flash drive and Sandra's phone and the dried watermark of spilled orange juice at the table's edge, and she thought about her father. Marcus Boone had been a welder at the Millhaven shipyard for 9 years. He came home smelling like metal and wore his work clothes until after dinner and read paperback westerns in the armchair by the window until her mother told him to come to bed. He had a laugh that arrived unexpectedly and lasted longer than you would predict from the size of what had caused it. On Saturday mornings, he made pancakes and let Ellie put too much syrup on hers without commenting. He had stepped between a man with a knife and a woman he had never met on a Tuesday night and had not walked back out. She had spent 2 years being furious at him for that choice, for the calculation he had performed in the seconds between hearing the scream and walking through the door, and the result he had arrived at, which was that the woman inside the store mattered more in that moment than the fact that his daughter was at home waiting for him to come back. She had hated him for being brave because his bravery had left her alone in a way that nothing afterward had fully addressed. But sitting in this room with her father's name on the wall and his brother across the city on a motorcycle heading toward a meeting that could go in any direction, she understood something she had not been able to reach before. Her father had not walked into that store because he wanted to die. He had walked in because he could not walk past. Because some people are built in a way that makes turning away from someone else's danger feel like a slow and quiet dying of a different kind. A death of the self by degrees that happens without drama and without anyone noticing until there is not enough of the original person left to recognize. It was not a choice in the way that choosing a route or a restaurant is a choice. It was architecture. Bone deep. The structure you are made of rather than anything you decide. She had inherited the same stubbornness, the same refusal to look away from a thing that needed looking at. She had felt it in the gas station parking lot on 4th Street when she watched the man in the fitted jacket and knew something was wrong and followed him rather than moving on. She had felt it in the town hall meeting basement when the renderings went up on the screen and she understood what she was seeing and did not leave. She was not her father. She knew that. But she was not nobody either. At 7:22, Bodie's phone buzzed on the bar. He looked at the screen, and his stillness changed quality in the specific way that stillness changes when information arrives that requires immediate physical response. Silver sedan on Henderson, he said. It is a back. Ellie was at the window before she finished registering the decision to move. Through the frosted glass, she could see the outline of a vehicle parked across the street at the angle she had learned to recognize over 11 days of observation from bus benches and library windows. the angle that gave the driver a direct and unobstructed sightline to the clubhouse entrance. "That is not the SUV," she said. "No," Body said. "Different car, same plates as last night, Ridgeline Security Solutions." Dale Roth was watching in the clubhouse himself, not through an operative in a fitted jacket, personally, which meant the timeline had not just been accelerated, it had already changed into something closer to immediate. "We need to reach Rita," Ellie said. "I have been trying since midnight," Bodhi said. "Straight to voicemail every time." Ellie took the folded piece of paper from her hoodie pocket. She looked at it. Then she looked at Sandra's phone, the one with the recording sitting on the table where Sandra had left it. She picked it up. "Hank said noon," Bodhi said. "Hank said if Rita does not call by noon." She looked at Bodhi steadily. "She has not called. It has been almost 6 hours. A second gun is about to be placed in my mother's apartment. The 48-hour window Warren Briggs gave his people is running." She held his gaze. "We do not have until noon." Body looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the bar and crossed his arms and said nothing, which was his way of saying, "This is yours to make." Ellie dialed. It rang once. FBI Field Office, Carver City, Agent Marsh. "My name is Ellie Boone," she said. "I am 13 years old and I am calling from the Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse on Henderson Avenue in Millhaven, Oregon. I have information about a criminal conspiracy involving a city council candidate named Warren Briggs, a private security firm called Ashcroft Partners, planted police weapons, and the coordinated attempt to destroy the Iron Ridge Riders Motorcycle Club through manufactured evidence. I have documentary financial evidence, a full corporate chain connecting all the parties, and an audio recording of the candidate personally directing a breaking and entering at this building last night." A pause on the other end. "Then how old did you say you were?" 13, does that matter?" Another pause, longer this time, carrying the weight of someone recalibrating. "Where are you right now?" "I told you, the Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse on Henderson Avenue. Do not let anyone leave. I am dispatching agents now." He paused. "Miss Boone, is anyone in immediate danger?" Ellie looked around the room, at Bodhi with the drying cut above his eye, at Roach with his arm immobilized by the improvised sling Sandra had constructed from a bar towel and a belt, who had not complained once about the pain in it, at Sandra Locke, who had backed up everything on a flash drive and recorded a criminal conspiracy on her phone while 3 professionals ransacked the room around her, and who was now drinking black coffee in the corner booth with the composure of someone who has done exactly what they came to do and is content to wait for what comes next, at the folded piece of paper she had just finished using, at the empty chair at the head of the table where Hank had been sitting when she walked through his door 19 days into her homelessness and changed the shape of everything either of them understood about what was happening on Henderson Avenue. "Everyone in this building is in danger," she said, "and there is a woman at 4B Ridgeline Avenue who does not know that she is." She ended the call. The 40 minutes that followed were the longest she had experienced since the night she climbed out of the bathroom window, which was a comparison she would not have believed possible at the time. At 7:58, Hank's Harley came back up Henderson Avenue. Ellie heard it separating itself from the morning traffic before she could see it through the frosted glass, the particular signature of that engine becoming distinct, and she was watching through the window when he pulled into the lot. He came through the front door and stopped in the frame and looked at the room, at Bodhi and Roach and Sandra and Ellie, and something in the set of his face told her the meeting at the foundry had not gone exactly as he had planned, but it had not gone the way he had feared either. "Vaughn came," he said, and Bodhi asked. "He did not know about the guns." Hank moved to the table and stood with both hands on the plywood. He knew about the property deals, the shell companies, the below-market sales through the commission. He signed off because Briggs packaged it as legitimate economic development and because there were personal incentives he was not turning down. But the weapons, the frame job, the planted evidence, the task force connection. He says he did not know. I think he is telling the truth about that piece specifically. I think Briggs kept the criminal operation away from Vaughn because Vaughn would have drawn a line. "Did you believe him enough to use him?" Ellie asked. Hank looked at her. The distinction she had drawn was not lost on him. "Yes, that is different from trusting him, and I am not confusing the two." "Marsh is already on his way here," Ellie said. Hank was very still for a moment. "You called before noon," he said. "The second gun is moving today. Dale is parked across the street. The recording we have has a 48-hour window in it, and part of that window is already gone." She held his gaze. "You said my story and my voice. I used them. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he pulled a chair out and sat down. What did Vaughn give you? Sandra asked from the corner. Everything he has. He wants to cooperate. He says he has email chains, meeting notes, text messages, records of every conversation between himself and Briggs going back almost 2 years. Hank paused. And he told me something else. The raid on this clubhouse was originally scheduled for last week. Anonymous tip to the gang task force timed to coincide with the stolen weapon report the task force officer filed. They were going to find the gun, make the arrests, and have the story running on local television by the 6 o'clock news. What stopped it? Body asked. The gun disappeared, Hank said. Someone moved it before the coordinated tip went in. He looked at Ellie. She understood what he was not saying. She had moved to the far corner of the lot on the morning she found the gun away from it because she was afraid of what would happen if she touched it. She had not moved it. But her presence in the lot, her rearrangement of the tarp and the canvas, had apparently been enough to shift the placement enough that whoever came to verify it before calling in the tip found something wrong. Briggs pulled Dale into an emergency meeting at the campaign office. Vaughn was present for part of it. He heard Briggs order the second weapon placed within 72 hours and the raid executed by end of week. End of week is today, Ellie said. Yes. Hank's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something moved through his face, a complex wave of relief and dread, arriving simultaneously, the specific expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular call long enough that when it finally comes, he is not certain whether it brings good news or the confirmation of something he has been dreading. He answered. He listened. His free hand pressed slowly against his thigh. Where are you right now? He asked. He listened again. Are you hurt? Whatever she said made his jaw tighten. Stay exactly where you are. Help is on its way. It is over, Rita, all of it. He lowered the phone. Rita, he said. The room was absolutely still. They picked her up outside her apartment last night. 2 men, professional in every detail. They drove her to a warehouse in the industrial district on the south side and held her for 5 hours. His voice was level and controlled in the way that voices are level when the alternative is something that cannot be undone. They told her if she did not drop the investigation, her career was finished and her daughter's scholarship at Oregon State would disappear. They took her phone. They took her notebooks and every piece of paper she had with her. Then they drove her to a gas station on Route 9 and left her there without a car at 2 in the morning. He paused. She walked 3 miles to find a payphone. She has been trying to reach me since before 3. The silence was different from all the silences before. They threatened her daughter, Bodie said. His voice had dropped to something that was barely above a statement of observed fact, which in Bodie was the register that came before the one that had no words in it at all. Yes, Hank said. They took a detective, Bodie said. Held her against her will for 5 hours. Threatened a college student who has nothing to do with any of this. Yes, then this is past the point of being a real estate problem, Bodie said. Nobody argued with that. Outside on Henderson Avenue, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who have done this in a variety of configurations and know which variables to control, first 3 black sedans with federal plates turned onto the block from the south end. Bodie was at the window. Federal, 3 vehicles. And behind the federal vehicles, at the far end of Henderson Avenue, where it intersected with 5th Street, something else was happening. Pickup trucks and motorcycles were turning onto the street from the cross blocks, from the parking lots on either side from driveways that Ellie had not known belonged to people connected to the Iron Ridge Riders. Their engines added to one another until the sound coming through the old brick walls of the clubhouse was not individual machines but a combined presence, a vibration that moved through the floor and into the bones of everyone standing in the room. The Iron Ridge Riders, not just the members who had been in the building through the night, but others, men and women Ellie had never seen pulling onto Henderson Avenue from every available direction with the unhurried certainty of people who have been called and have answered and are not in any particular hurry because they are already here. She counted 34 bikes before she stopped counting. Agent Cole Marsh was in his early 40s and had the look of someone who had been awake since the phone rang and was not bothering to pretend otherwise. He came through the front door in a dark windbreaker with his badge on a chain, his eyes already moving through the room with the practiced intake of a federal agent arriving at a scene that is more complicated than any prior briefing has prepared him for. His eyes found Ellie. She was at the table with the flash drive in front of her and Sandra's phone beside it in the dried orange juice watermark at the edge of the wood, and she met his gaze without looking away. "You are Ellie Boone," he said. "Yes." "You called 40 minutes ago." "Yes." He pulled a chair to the table and sat across from her without ceremony. Not the way adults usually sat across from her, with the small managed distance that says, "I am here, but not too close, but squarely and directly as an equal, who has decided the conversation is serious." "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning." So she told it for the third time, and for the third time the telling was different because each time you tell a story to someone new, you are also telling it to yourself again. And each time you find the places where the pieces fit more precisely than you had understood before. The storage lot, the canvas wrap, the gun in its clean plastic bag. 11 days of watching the black SUV and the man in the fitted jacket, the town hall meeting and the architectural renderings, the walk down Ridgeline Avenue, Dale Roth at the kitchen table with his professional voice, the library, Ridgeline Security Solutions, walking into the clubhouse on day 19, the serial number tracing back to the task force, the corporate chain connecting Briggs to Ashcroft to Ridgeline to Dale, the break-in, the recording. She told him about her mother. Marsh listened without writing anything down, which she understood to mean he was recording. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then looked at Sandra Locke. "The financial documentation," he said. Sandra slid the flash drive across the table. "The recording," he said. Sandra placed the phone beside it. Marsh looked at both items, then at Ellie. "The second weapon. My mother's apartment, 4B Ridgeline Avenue. Dale Roth lives there with her. He has been parked across the street from this building since before 7 this morning. If he is here watching, someone else is handling the apartment." Marsh picked up his radio. He spoke into it with the precision and economy of someone who has delivered instructions under operational pressure many times and whose instinct is to waste no words. He directed an intercept team to Ridgeline Avenue. Non-tactical approach. Civilian present in the unit, female adult considered vulnerable. Possible evidence tampering in active progress. He stood, looked at Hank. "Henderson is secured. My agents will preserve the scene here and begin the formal evidence documentation. We go to Ridgeline now." Ellie was already on her feet. They went in Bodie's truck, Ellie between Hank and the window, watching the city move past at a speed that felt insufficient for what was at stake. Gas stations and insurance offices, and a dry cleaner with a handwritten sign. A school crossing with the yellow light still flashing from the morning rush. The ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea what was unraveling inside it on a November morning that looked like every other November morning from the outside. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and thought about Grace Boone. Her mother had been someone different once. Not before everything that was too far back to reach clearly, but before her father died, before the grief took up residence in the rooms of their apartment and began slowly displacing everything else it found there. Before Dale Roth moved in and the displacement accelerated into something that no longer looked like grief from the outside, but was still grief underneath grief that had learned to wear a different mask. Grace Boone had made real dinners, had watched things on television that made her laugh in a way that filled the room, had sat in the third row of the school play and cried a little, not because the play was moving, but because she was proud and did not know how to be proud quietly. That person was still in there somewhere. Ellie believed this not because she could prove it, but because the need to believe it had persisted through everything, through 14 months on Ridgeline Avenue and 19 days of concrete and cold, and persistence over that kind of duration and under that kind of pressure means something. The truck turned onto Ridgeline Avenue. 2 federal vehicles were already at the curb. Agents in dark windbreakers were moving toward the building's entrance with the controlled purposefulness of people who know exactly where they are going and why. From a car parked halfway down the block, Dale Roth was being removed in handcuffs by 2 agents who were performing the operation with the specific professionalism of people for whom this is a familiar procedure. He was wearing sweatpants and a gray t-shirt. No fitted jacket, no tactical boots, no polished professional appearance. Just a man in the clothes he had been wearing when the morning arrived without warning, stripped of every layer of constructed authority. Ellie watched him through the truck window as they pulled to the curb. She had expected to feel something large, something proportionate to the 14 months of his presence in the apartment on Ridgeline, to the sound of the kitchen chair, hitting her mother, to the professional voice through the window that she had heard and not understood, to the 19 nights of concrete that had followed the night she finally climbed out of his reach. She felt nothing large. She felt the quiet recognition of something ending. Dale Roth, without his layers, was simply a man who had made a series of choices that led to this specific curb on this specific morning and handcuffs being placed into a federal vehicle. The choices had seemed like power when he was making them. They looked like their actual size now. She was out of the truck before it fully stopped. Marsh was ahead of her on the sidewalk radio, at his mouth already receiving information from the agents who had gone in ahead. He turned as she came up behind him. "We found it," he said, "under the bathroom sink. Same profile as the first one. Glock 19 clean bag, fresh placement, no weathering. Prepaid phone in the nightstand drawer with text messages to and from a number already identified as registered to the Briggs campaign office." He held her gaze. The second weapon would have been in position within the hour. If the coordinated tip had gone in before we arrived, the task force would have had justification for immediate entry. He looked at Hank. "It is over. The mechanism is dismantled." Hank said nothing. He was looking at the building's entrance. Ellie followed his gaze. A female agent was coming through the front door with one hand on the elbow of a woman in a gray bathrobe who was navigating the morning light with the slow deliberateness of someone making the transition between sleep and waking, while also making a much larger transition that she had not been given any preparation for. The bathrobe was too large, the kind of garment that belongs to someone who has been wearing it past the hours when it is appropriate, because the energy required to change into something else has not been available. One of the house slippers had come partially off her heel. Her hair was unwashed, and her hands were wrapped around her own elbows in the specific posture of a person holding herself together from the outside when nothing internal is doing that job adequately. Grace Boone. Ellie stopped on the sidewalk. She had not seen her mother in 19 days. She had not spoken to her in longer than that, not in the way that constitutes actual conversation between two people who are present to each other rather than occupying the same space while both being largely absent. The woman coming through the door was the same person who had sat in the third row of the school play. She was also not that person. She was the distance between who Grace Boone had been and who she had become, and that distance was visible in every detail of how she occupied the morning. The pallor and the thinness and the slight delay in her gaze, as if the signal from the world was arriving a fraction of a second late. Then Grace's eyes found Ellie. The delay disappeared. Something crossed Grace Boone's face that was not any of the things Ellie had prepared herself for. Not the elaborate remorse of someone performing an apology, not the deflection of someone who cannot face what they owe. Something more fundamental than either of those. Recognition stripped of everything that had accumulated on top of it over the past year and a half, every compromise and absence and failure. A mother seeing her daughter on a sidewalk in the morning light. "Ellie," she said, "just the name." The way names are said not to get attention, but to confirm that the person in front of you is actually there and not a product of a mind that has been producing unreliable images. Ellie walked toward her, not running, not with the momentum of someone who has been waiting to close a distance, just walking across a sidewalk at the speed of someone who has decided what they are going to do and does not need to perform the decision. She stopped 2 feet away. "I need you to get help," she said. Not the number to call kind. Not the kind where someone gives you a pamphlet and points you at a door. The kind where you go somewhere and stay and let people who know what they are doing help you find your way back. She kept her voice steady and clear. "I will find the place. There are people who will help pay for it. You just have to say yes." Grace's face moved through several things in close succession. The familiar distance came back briefly, the chemical buffer that had been mediating her experience of the world for too long, and then it receded again. Her hands tightened on her own elbows. "I do not know how to do that," she said. "I do not know how to be who I was before. I have not been that person in so long that I do not know if she is still in there." "You do not need to know how," Ellie said. "You just need to say yes. That is the only step that is yours to take right now." A silence between them on the sidewalk. The city continuing its morning around them, indifferent, the way cities are always indifferent to the private moments happening inside their ordinary operations. Grace Boone looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she nodded. Small but present, real. Ellie reached out and placed her hand on her mother's arm. Not a hug, not a full reconciliation, not any of the large gestures the moment might have demanded. if either of them had been the kind of person who needed large gestures to believe something was real. Just the physical fact of contact. The first touch between them in months, and it carried everything that could not be said yet, and the possibility of everything that might eventually be built. One careful piece at a time, over a span of time that neither of them could calculate from where they were standing. It was enough for now. It was genuinely enough. Marsh appeared beside Hank at the curb. He spoke quietly, maintaining the separation between the official proceedings and the private moment on the sidewalk, with the tact of someone who has worked enough crisis situations to understand that human beings need both kinds of space simultaneously. Vaughn went to the Carver City field office at 7 this morning, Marsh said. Before your call came in, he brought printed emails, handwritten meeting notes, and a signed preliminary statement. His attorney met him there. He paused. He is cooperating fully and voluntarily. Hank absorbed this. Briggs, he asked? Our agents went to the campaign headquarters at 8:15. He was in the process of destroying documents when they arrived. That is obstruction of justice on top of every underlying charge, and it happened in front of building security cameras that were recording the entire time. Something in Marsh's expression suggested his opinion of this decision. The audio recording your forensic accountant made in this building last night will be central to the case. You can hear him directing a criminal operation in real time. There is no interpretation available to a defense attorney that makes that recording anything other than what it is. Rita Flynn, Hank said. Detective Flynn's situation, the abduction, the threats against her daughter, those are federal kidnapping charges that compound the existing conspiracy charges significantly. Her career is fully intact. She is a victim and a primary witness, and everyone in that department who matters understands exactly what happened to her and why. Marsh paused. She vouched for the Iron Ridge Riders when I reported the initial call to my supervisor. She said if Hank Cross is involved, the information is solid. I acted on that recommendation. In this case, it was the correct decision. He looked at Hank directly when he said that last part, not as a courtesy, as a fact being stated. Hank said nothing. He was watching Ellie and Grace on the sidewalk, the careful distance between them and the hand on the arm, and the quality of stillness in both of them that was not the stillness of people who have run out of things to say, but the stillness of people who are saying something that does not require words. The task force officers, Bodie asked. 3 of them are under internal affairs review as of this morning. The officer who filed the 2 stolen weapon reports plus 2 others whose names appear in documents Vaughn brought in. That process moves independently of the broader case, but it is moving. The day moved forward with the mechanical inevitability of a system that has been running in the wrong direction and has been turned around and is now moving in the right one, not smoothly, not without friction, but in the correct direction and with enough momentum to continue. Warren Briggs was formally charged that afternoon. Conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, directing the commission of multiple felonies, including the theft and deliberate placement of stolen police weapons. His attorney released a statement characterizing the charges as politically motivated. By 6 o'clock, the statement had been seen by enough people who had also seen the audio recording to have generated a specific kind of reaction in the comments sections of every local news outlet in Southern Oregon. The Iron Ridge Riders were not the villains in this story. They had been the intended victims of someone who was very good at making other people the villains in stories he wrote about them. Dale Roth was charged separately that evening. Conspiracy evidence tampering, 3 counts of domestic violence that Grace Boone agreed to pursue from a chair in an FBI conference room in Carver City, with a cup of coffee in front of her and Ellie sitting beside her. He did not make bail. The man who had run the operational center of Warren Briggs's conspiracy from a kitchen table on Ridgeline Avenue was remanded to federal custody in the clothes he had been wearing when the morning arrived without warning. Earl Vaughn resigned from the City Property Commission that afternoon and entered full cooperation with federal prosecutors. He would eventually testify across 2 days about every email, every meeting, every conversation with Briggs about the Henderson Avenue development scheme. His attorney negotiated a reduced charge arrangement in exchange for the completeness and accuracy of his cooperation. He would serve time, but less of it than the people he testified against. 3 days after the arrest, Vance held his own accounting in front of the full Iron Ridge membership. All 29 members who could be reached sat in the mismatched chairs and along the bar and on the stairs, and Vance stood at the center of the room and told the truth without ornamentation or performance. The debt. Cassidy, the 4 months of information. The key. He stated each fact and let it sit without attempting to frame it as anything other than what it was. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not perform remorse. He presented an account and accepted what followed from it. The vote was 19-10. He stayed. His VP patch came off. The position was left empty, the chair at that side of the table not filled and not replaced. A visible vacancy that would remain for as long as the membership determined it needed to remain. An absence that was also a question and a possibility depending on what came after. Vance accepted that without argument or qualification. He walked to the corner of the room where Sandra Locke had set up her laptop 3 nights earlier, poured himself a cup of coffee from the machine behind the bar, and sat down. He did not leave. He did not explain the staying because the staying was its own explanation. In the grammar that the Iron Ridge writers used for things that mattered, showing up and remaining was a statement that required no accompanying words. Rita Flynn came back to the clubhouse 4 days after the arrests. She came through the front door in the middle of a Thursday afternoon with a split lip that was still healing at the corners and bruised wrists she had not bothered to conceal under long sleeves. And she sat at the bar and let Bodie tell her about the break-in and the fight and the zip ties and the recording while she drank black coffee and did not change expression until he got to the part about Ellie standing in the room with a phone in her hand and the FBI number on a piece of paper. Then something moved across Rita's face that would have been a smile if her lip had been in the condition to form one fully. 13 years old, she said. Standing in the middle of this room, Bodie said, with a phone and a piece of paper and her voice not shaking. Rita shook her head slowly in the way people shake their heads when something has exceeded their frame of reference in a direction they did not anticipate. Every time I think I have seen every variation of what people are capable of. Grace Boone entered a residential treatment program in Carver City 12 days after the arrests. The program was 45 minutes from Millhaven and had space available and staff that Rita had personally verified before recommending it because Rita had opinions about the difference between programs that help people and programs that process them. Hank paid for it from his own account, not from club funds, from money he had saved over 2 decades of motorcycle repair work and a small monthly pension from his years of military service. He did not tell Ellie he had done this. She found out from Bodie, who told her because he believed that certain things should be visible to the people they concern most directly, and that debts of care are not diminished by being known. The visits were Wednesdays, 30 minutes, sometimes 40, short enough that they did not exceed what either of them could sustain with honesty long enough that something was building inside them. The first visit, Grace could not stop apologizing. The second visit, Ellie asked her to stop. Not unkindly, simply stop. The third visit, they sat in the clean, well-lit room for 22 minutes without speaking, and the silence between them was more honest than any of the conversation in the previous 2 visits had been. By the fourth visit, Grace asked about the clubhouse, about Hank, about what it was like to live above a motorcycle club in a room she had painted herself, and Ellie told her. Not the violence of it, or the fear of the night of the break-in, or the specific weight of sitting in a room while grown men argued about whether her presence was more asset or liability. But the shape of it, men who wore leather and carried their histories on their skin and had built something that held together, not because they were required to be there, but because they had chosen to keep choosing it day after day, which was the only way anything worth belonging to got built and stayed built. Your father would have liked them, Grace said. It was the first true thing she had said about Marcus in longer than either of them could accurately calculate, and it sat between them, with the specific warmth of a truth that has been kept closed for too long and is finally being allowed to breathe. Ellie's room on the second floor of the Iron Ridge Riders Clubhouse was small and narrow with a single window that looked out over the storage lot where she had slept for 4 nights, without knowing that the building she was pressed against belonged to her blood. She painted the walls herself, a pale blue, the color of the sky over Millhaven, in the hour before the sun commits fully to being present. The transitional light that she had watched from too many cold mornings and had decided when she had a choice to make about it was her favorite light. Not dramatic, not a statement, just the color she wanted when she opened her eyes. Bodie helped her install the shelves. He drilled the holes and set the anchors and handed her the brackets to tighten, and did not comment on the fact that she tightened them more securely than was strictly necessary, which was a habit she had developed over 19 days of making sure things that kept her warm were not going to shift in the night. Roach his arm immobilized in a proper sling for 6 weeks following the break-in, which he described to anyone who asked as a wound sustained in defense of the club, and to Ellie privately as the most dramatic thing that had ever happened to him. And he was not ungrateful for the story, even if the arm had not been his preferred way to get it. Brought her a desk lamp from a thrift store on Pine Street and a rug that was slightly too large for the narrow floor and had to be folded under at one edge. She left it folded. The fold did not bother her. Hank signed in the temporary guardianship paperwork with the deliberate attention of a man who understands that some signatures are more consequential than any contract. Rita navigated the CPS process with the specific efficiency of someone who has made institutional systems do things they were not initially designed to do, and who knows which pressure points, in which arguments, in which combinations of the two are most effective. The process took 11 days, involved 3 phone calls that Ellie was not present for, and 1 meeting at which she was, and at the end of it, she had a legal address and a school enrollment form and a library card with her name on it. Ellie M. Boone. She read the name twice. Then she put the card in the front pocket of her hoodie, not the back, not the deep one, the accessible one, where she could put her hand on it without looking. She enrolled in Millhaven Middle School in time for the last quarter of the fall semester. The academic gap was real, and she did not minimize it to herself or to anyone else. There were things she did not know that her classmates had been taught while she was surviving, and she would need to learn them, and learning them would take sustained effort over a sustained period. She went every morning, down the stairs of the clubhouse, past the bar, and the pool table and the long table with the crack in its grain, out the front door onto Henderson Avenue, onto the bus at the corner. On mornings when Hank was at the clubhouse, he was at the bar with a coffee mug when she came through. He looked up, he nodded. The acknowledgement of one person confirming that another person is present, invisible, and not going anywhere. It was enough. It was, she had discovered, genuinely enough. The federal case moved through the system with the particular momentum of cases that have been well documented before they arrive at the prosecutor's desk. Marsh's team had the financial chain from Sandra's flash drive, the audio recording of Briggs directing the break-in, Vaughn's comprehensive cooperation, Rita Flynn's first-hand account of her abduction, the 2 planted weapons with their traceable serial numbers, and a forensic accountant prepared to testify to the complete picture of how the money had moved between Briggs's entities and Dale Roth's operation over 14 months. Briggs's legal team filed motions attempting to suppress the audio recording on the grounds that it had been obtained without a warrant. The motions failed because the recording had been made by Sandra Locke in a room she was lawfully present in, of individuals who had entered that room unlawfully. The legal analysis was not complicated. The audio stood. The grand jury returned indictments in 8 weeks. The trial date was set for the following spring. In the interval, Millhaven did what small cities do when a story that has been hidden inside their ordinary operations is suddenly visible. It argued about what it meant and whose fault it was and whether the warning signs had been there and who had been paying attention. The local newspaper ran 3 separate opinion pieces about the Henderson Avenue development plan, 2 of which said, the plan itself had been sound and the problem was only the methods used to advance it. And one of which said that a plan built on the manufactured destruction of a community institution was rotten at its foundation regardless of what the architectural renderings looked like. The Iron Ridge writers did not comment publicly. Hank had made the decision early that the club's involvement in the case would be communicated through Marsh's office and through whatever attorneys were involved and not through statements to the press. And he held to it even when a reporter from the Oregonian called the clubhouse 3 times in 1 week asking for an interview about the role the club had played in exposing the conspiracy. He referred every call to Marsh. Ellie was not named in any press coverage. Marsh had been deliberate about this. She was identified in case documents as a juvenile material witness, and her identity was protected under the standard provisions for minor witnesses in federal proceedings. The press knew a teenager was involved. They did not know her name or her age or the specific details of her 19 days in the storage lot or the fact that she had been the person who found the gun and understood what it meant and made the call that brought federal agents to Henderson Avenue on a November morning. She was fine with this. She had spent 19 days being no one. The skills she had developed during those 19 days, the ability to be present in a space without drawing attention to a burv, without being observed, to process information that was not directed at her, had not gone away simply because She now had a room and a legal address and a library card with her name on it. They were hers. She intended to keep them. What changed was not the capacity for invisibility, but the choice about when to use it. She used it when it served her. She did not use it when it cost her. The distinction felt important. On the Tuesday evening before Christmas, she and Hank drove to Carver City to visit Grace at the treatment facility. It was the 6th visit. Ellie had been going alone on Wednesdays, but Hank had asked 2 weeks earlier if he could come for one of the visits, and she had said yes, and the Tuesday evening had been the first time that worked for both of them. Grace Boone met them in the common room, which had chairs upholstered in a green that was trying to be cheerful and landing somewhere short of it, in a window that looked out onto a courtyard with a bare November garden that would presumably look better in spring. Grace was dressed in clothes she had selected herself, not the gray bathrobe of the Ridgeline Avenue sidewalk, actual clothes, jeans and a sweater that had been hers before everything, and that she had asked Ellie to bring from the storage unit where Grace's belongings had gone after the apartment was vacated. She looked at Hank for a long moment when he came through the door beside Ellie. "You have Marcus's eyes," she said. "I always thought so when I saw photographs. You have exactly his eyes." Hank looked at her. Something moved in his face. "He talked about you," he said, "before we lost touch. He used to call you the one person who never told him he was being too much." Grace smiled. It was small and careful, the smile of a person who is relearning how to produce one and is not yet certain it will be received as intended. "He was never too much," she said. "He was exactly right. The problem was, the world was not always big enough for how right he was." They sat for 40 minutes. They talked about Marcus and about the shipyard and about the house on Callaway Street that had been sold after he died and about what Ellie's father had been like at 18, which was a version of him that Ellie had never had access to and received now, with the specific attention of someone hearing a language they have always wanted to know and are only now being taught. On the drive back to Millhaven, Hank was quiet for the first half hour. Then he said, "She is going to be okay." "I think so too," Ellie said. "It will take longer than either of you wants it to." "I know." He drove. The highway outside Millhaven was mostly empty at 9 in the evening, the December dark pressing against the windows of the truck from all sides, the headlights making a tunnel of road ahead of them. "Marcus used to say that the hardest thing about people you love is that they get to be who they are," Hank said. "But who you need them to be, not who would make your life simpler if they were. Who they actually are." He paused. "He said it about your mother, and he said it about me, and he said it about himself, and he was right about all three of us." Ellie looked out the window at the dark fields alongside the highway. "He was right about a lot of things," she said. He was. He was also wrong about some things." "Like what?" "He thought cutting me off would protect you," Hank said. "He thought if you did not know the Iron Ridge Riders existed, you would be safer from whatever we might pull you into. And he was right that I had given him reasons to think that." He kept his eyes on the road. "He was wrong that the solution was distance. The solution was for me to be better at the thing I was doing badly, which took longer than either of us had." Ellie thought about this. "You got there," she said. 7 years after he stopped being here to see it," Hank said. "Yeah, I got there." The truck moved through the December dark toward Millhaven, and neither of them said anything for the rest of the drive, and the silence was not empty, but full. The way silences are full when two people have said what needed to be said and are now simply carrying it together in the same direction. Before she enrolled in school, before the guardianship paperwork was signed, before any of the official structures that would eventually organize her new life were in place, there was a period of approximately 10 days in which Ellie existed in the clubhouse, the way she had existed in the storage lot, present, but not yet formally part of the place. During this period, she moved carefully and observed everything and spoke when she had something to say, and was otherwise quiet in the way she had learned to be quiet, not as absence, but as attention. The Iron Ridge Riders, for their part, received her the way they received most things that landed in their space without prior announcement, which was to say, practically and without drama. Body showed her where the bathroom was, and where the extra blankets were kept, and where the circuit breaker box was, in case something went out, which she found obscurely touching, the decision to tell her the location of the circuit breaker being its own kind of statement about her being expected to remain. Roach brought food upstairs when he was making food for himself, setting a plate outside her door without knocking, because he had apparently determined that knocking was its own kind of pressure, and that leaving food was a simpler message. Sandra Locke stopped by twice in the first week to check that the flash drive backup was accessible and that Ellie understood how the encrypted file system worked, which Ellie had not needed to be told, but appreciated being told anyway, because it meant Sandra was treating her as someone whose understanding of the technical situation mattered. Vance in those 10 days said nothing to her directly, but she had watched him watching her with the careful evaluative attention he applied to most things, and she had not looked away when she caught him doing it. And after the third time this had happened, he had given her a single short nod that she had recognized as the acknowledgement of a verdict reached after sufficient observation that she was what she appeared to be. That was as much as she needed from Vance at that point. From Hank, she received something more complicated, which was the specific company of a man who was still learning how to be what she needed him to be and was doing the learning honestly and without pretense. He made coffee in the mornings and left a cup for her at the end of the bar when she came downstairs. Not with ceremony, not with comment, simply as a fact of the morning. He asked her questions about school when she started and listened to the answers the way her father had listened to things he considered worth attending to with the whole of his attention, rather than the fraction that adults sometimes offered children when they were waiting for the conversation to arrive at a point they considered relevant. He also made mistakes. He defaulted sometimes to telling her what to do rather than asking what she needed. He occasionally forgot that she was capable of carrying more than he was offering to let her carry. He checked in on her in ways that were appropriate for a worried adult and that she did not always need and that she learned to accept because the intention behind them was accurate even when the execution was slightly off. He was learning. She gave him room to learn. This was she understood what family actually looked like from the inside. Not the version from television where everyone communicated exactly what they needed at exactly the right moment and conflicts resolved in the span of a single conversation. The version that was made of people trying to understand each other accurately and not always succeeding in continuing anyway, because the alternative was a kind of poverty that neither of them was willing to choose. On the first Saturday of December, the Iron Ridge Riders blocked Henderson Avenue with the city's permission, a detail that Ellie found quietly significant given the city's recent involvement in attempting to remove them from it and set up tables on the sidewalk and in the street and invited the neighborhood. 34 motorcycles lined the block. The soup kitchen on Birch Street sent 4 people with aluminum trays of food. A man Ellie did not recognize arrived with a generator and strings of lights that turned the old brick face of the clubhouse warm gold in the December afternoon. A woman from 3 blocks away, whom Ellie had never seen before, set up a table with coffee urns and stood behind it for 3 hours filling cups for people who stayed to talk. Families came. People who lived within a few blocks and had been maintaining a careful managed distance from the Iron Ridge Riders for years based on what they had been told about them by people with specific interests in what they believed. People who had sat in the town hall meeting and listened to Warren Briggs tell them the men on Henderson Avenue were dangerous, and who had gone home uncertain whether to believe it and who now knew something different. People who came not because they had been formally invited, but because they had seen the bikes gathering and understood that something was happening that they were permitted to be part of. Body ran a folding table where he performed free oil level checks and tire pressure assessments on anyone's vehicle performing the work with the focused precision of the combat medic he had been before he became anything else, which was a fact about him that very few people in the neighborhood had known before that afternoon. Roach did card tricks for a cluster of children who watched with the specific total absorption that children bring to things they cannot explain. The tricks were not subtle, and at least one of them involved a technique that Ellie recognized as sleight of hand from a book she had read at the library, but the children watching did not know that, and their response was genuine, regardless of the method. Vance stood at the outer edge of the gathering against the brick wall of the clubhouse, not inside the crowd, and not withdrawn from it, occupying the specific position of a man who was present and accountable without making claims about his current welcome beyond the fact of his presence. He had a cup of coffee and he did not perform anything. He simply stood there in the December cold, in the space between what he had done and what came after it. His daughter Cassidy came that afternoon. Ellie saw them from across the street, a young woman getting out of a car and walking toward her father with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to close a distance that had become necessary to close, but who has not yet decided how close. Vance did not move toward her. He let her come at whatever pace she needed. They stood apart for a few minutes, and then the space between them contracted slightly, and then a little more. No embrace, but proximity, the shared occupation of the same ground. The beginning of something that would take longer than an afternoon. Ellie understood that particular geometry. She had been practicing it herself every Wednesday for 4 weeks in a clean room in Carver City. Late in the afternoon, when the December sun had moved behind the roofline to the west, and the temperature had found the level it intended to hold, through the evening Hank came and sat on the front step of the clubhouse with a cup of coffee. Ellie sat beside him with the hot chocolate Roach had made, which was, as she had come to expect, slightly too strong and exactly right. The steam from both cups rose into the cold air and crossed and disappeared. They watched the street for a while without speaking. The particular company of two people who have been through something together and have arrived at the place where the silence between them does not require filling. Vaughn's testimony starts next month, Hank said. I know. Marsh called on Thursday. He is going to want you there, not to testify, just to be there. I will be there. They watched the street. Barstow, Ellie said. Hank looked at her. You said my father told you that you wanted to be a hero, but you did not know how to be one without breaking something. Yes, he was right. I know he was. But you learned, she said. You did not go after Dale when you found out who he was. You did not send anyone to the apartment on Ridgeline to confront him. You did not do any of the things that would have handed Briggs the narrative he needed. You called a detective. You called a federal agent. You let me make the call. She held the mug in both hands. That is knowing how. That is the difference between Barstow and this. Hank was quiet for a moment. It took 7 years, he said. Most things worth knowing take longer than you want them to, she said. He looked at her. The December light was low and golden on the street and on the faces of the people moving through it and on the 34 motorcycles parked along the curb, their chrome catching what light remained. Something settled in Hank's expression that had not been settled before, a load being distributed differently, weight that had been held in one place for a long time, finding a better arrangement. Was he scared? Ellie asked. My dad, when he walked into that store on the Tuesday night. Hank looked at the street, at the people and the bikes and the string lights turning the old brick gold, and the tables with the food, and the children who had stopped watching card tricks and were now running between the motorcycles, pretending the gaps between them were something else. Yeah, he said. I think he was genuinely terrified. But he went anyway. He went anyway. He paused. He always went anyway. That was the thing about Marcus that I could never figure out whether to be proud of or angry about. He was afraid of the same things everyone else is afraid of, and he went anyway every single time. Ellie nodded. She set her mug on the step beside her and looked at her hands in the December afternoon light. Clean, nails trimmed, the hands of a girl who slept in a bed in a room painted the color she had chosen, who woke up every morning and went down the stairs past the bar and out the door onto Henderson Avenue, and came back every afternoon to a building where people looked up when she came in and nodded because she was real and present and not going anywhere. I am not going to be invisible anymore, she said. I know, Hank said. Not for safety, not for survival, not for any reason I choose. I know. She picked up the mug, stood, and walked down the steps. The crowd on Henderson Avenue received her the way that currents receive something that belongs in them, not swallowing or obscuring, but simply carrying forward. And she moved into it, and the street received her, and the people around her registered her presence in the ordinary way that people register the presence of someone they expect to see. Across the street, a girl from her school waved from the food table. Ellie waved back and crossed between two parked Harleys toward where the girl was standing. A man she did not recognize said her name as she passed, and she answered with his name because she had learned it, and it was his. And using people's names correctly was a form of acknowledgement she had decided to practice. Hank Cross sat on the front step of the Iron Ridge Riders clubhouse and watched his brother's daughter move through the crowd on Henderson Avenue and did not look away until she had been absorbed into it completely and was simply part of the afternoon, indistinguishable from anyone else there, except to someone who was specifically looking for her. His coffee was cold in the cup. He did not care. He had been thinking about power and strength for the past several weeks, since the morning he rode back from the foundry on River Road and found the clubhouse in the aftermath of the break-in and understood the full shape of what had been arrayed against the Iron Ridge Riders. Warren Briggs had wielded power, Money connections accessed the ability to direct systems and institutional resources toward his ends and away from the people those systems were designed to serve. Power had let him build a machine that had come very close to working exactly as he intended. But power was the more brittle thing. Strength was the girl who followed a surveillance vehicle on foot through a city she was surviving in and took notes on a library bookmark. Strength was the 13-year-old who sat in the back row of a town hall meeting and read the architectural renderings and understood what they meant for the people who would lose what was in them. Strength was walking through a door into a room full of strangers and saying, "I need to talk to whoever is in charge," and not letting the voice shake. Strength was staying and showing up and returning and beginning again. Body appeared beside him on the step. He was carrying 2 cups, one of which he handed to Hank without comment. Fresh coffee still hot. They sat without speaking in the way that people sit who have been through enough together that silence is not a problem requiring solution, but simply the shape of a moment between things that are said. Down the block, one Harley engine turned over, then a second. The sound built in the way it always built, not all at once, but by accumulation. Each engine adding to the ones already running until the combined sound was not individual machines, but a single presence, a vibration that moved through the old brick in the cold December air, and the bones of the people standing on Henderson Avenue. The sound of something that had been built over a long time by imperfect people, making imperfect choices and had held together anyway. The sound of something that was going to last.